Okay, good afternoon, everybody. If you can take a seat. Can I actually encourage people to try and kind of move down the aisles a little bit, because we're expecting pretty much a full house this afternoon. Just makes it easier for people if they're arriving a little bit late to be able to find a seat. Thank you. Okay, so I'm Liz Bentley, Chief Executive at the Royal Meteorological Society. Welcome you to this Royal Meteorological Society and Grantham Institute meeting. I'll hand you over to Martin in a minute, who's going to chair the afternoon, but I'm just going to do some health and safety before we get started. So the first thing to say is we're not expecting a fire alarm this afternoon, so if we hear an alarm, it's for real and we need to exit the building. There's one fire exit in this room at the back, the door you came in. If you head down the stairs, then we need to congregate out on Queen Square, just out to the left here, on my right, your left. Can I please ask as well if you can switch your phones on to silent or switch them off. If you like to use social media, please feel free to tweet about this meeting. We have a hashtag #RMetsMeets that you can use. So happy for you to share your experience this afternoon. We are recording the whole afternoon, and the video and audio will be available on the website, as will the presentations as well. But I would ask if you do ask a question, and you wish to remain anonymous, please don't state your name or your affiliation when asking a question. If you're happy for that to be shared in the recording, then please feel free to state your name, but if you're not happy, then please don't. We'll be emailing out some feedback forms straight after the meeting. Please fill them in. It's really helpful for us just to really understand what works and what doesn't work about the meetings, and any future meeting suggestions as we go forward. We tend to put on about 75 meetings each year, so lots of different interesting topics that we can provide meetings on. So any suggestions that you have would be very welcome. Talking of future meetings, we have our May meeting taking place at the Institute of Physics, their new venue near King's Cross Station. The title of the meeting is I'm a Meteorologist, and it's basically a celebration of meteorology and those who work in the field. And we also have a June event, also again in London. This is a new event for us. It's called the Climate Change Forum, and it's taking place at the Coin Street Conference Centre near Waterloo Station. But more information on our website. So I'm going to hand over to Martin for what I think will be a very interesting afternoon.
Thank you, Liz. Welcome, everybody. My name is Martin Siegert. I am co-director of the Institute, Climate Change and Environment, and I am an Antarctic glaciologist. Delighted to welcome you to Imperial and to this event, co-organised by Grantham Institute, Imperial, and the Met Office, Royal Meteorological Society, beg your pardon, on Pliocene. Last time the Earth had 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Okay, so I'm going to set the scene a little bit. We've got 5 really brilliant speakers, and I'm going to introduce those to you in a minute. But I'm just going to say a few words about why we're here and what we hope to think about today. So this is a map of the Antarctic ice sheet. You see the red dot in the middle of East Antarctica is Vostok. And that's a Russian station. It's been a Russian station since the International Geophysical Year in 1957. And there is an amazing ice core that's been established. We know an awful lot about climate change as a consequence of looking in the past. And ice cores are brilliant because ice has little bubbles of air in it, and that air is a sample of the atmosphere from the time that ice previously fell as snow. It's a little time capsule. And the ice gets buried and buried, gets deeper and deeper, but the time capsule stays with it. So if you can take out the ice, you can sample the air in it, and that's not a proxy record of atmospheric composition. It's a direct measurement of the atmosphere from the time the ice fell as snow. So this is the ice core, comes out, this is what it looks like. And you can cut it up, and you can put it into a sampler, and you can actually sample the air from today, we'll do that right now, and then all the way back as far as the ice core goes. Now at Vostok Station, the ice core goes back 440,000 years. And this is the sort of record that you get. Hopefully you can see that in the past, but over here. Red dot, there we go. So this 440,000 years ago, and the level of carbon dioxide, which is on the y-axis, is 280 parts per million. And that's what it normally is
in between ice ages. Then we have an ice age, and the level of carbon dioxide is 180 parts per million. Then we're between ice ages again, just under 300, back again to 180, and so on. Between ice ages, 280 parts per million carbon dioxide, and in an ice age, it's 180 parts per million. It's pretty roughly what it is. The difference between those two, 100 parts per million, is enough to cause global temperatures to be 3 or 4 degrees warmer or colder than what they otherwise would be. And so you get an ice age when you get the cold conditions, low levels of carbon dioxide, and you get interglacials where the carbon dioxide levels go up to 280 parts per million, and we receive the warmth. All fine. We understand that. Ice cores are fantastic. We can extend this back a few more glacial cycles, in fact. No problems. The problem is, at 1850 or so, the level of carbon dioxide was around about here. And then we decided, maybe unwittingly, as our society, to start putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at an industrial scale. And the level of carbon dioxide is now over 400. It's about 411. We were just measuring it. There's the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. You can look at that, the Keeling curve. Check it out on Twitter. You get daily measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide, and it's 411 parts per million. Well, that's higher than any time in the last 500,000 years or so, significantly higher. And you can see in sort of geological significance and geological time, that's like instant. That's a switch change in the level of carbon dioxide that's gone in. Well, you might say, so what? Let's think about what the Earth's climate has been doing over the last 1,000 years. And this is an assemblance of lots of information of surface air temperatures from all around the world. And there's a bit of variability among that. And if there is a trend, before 1850, it was probably a slight cooling that was going on, but with variability. But then at 1850, around about this point here, as we started putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you see temperatures going up. This is the hockey stick, the Keeling hockey stick. And temperatures are going up as a consequence. This map, the two together, so the red line is the temperature, the green is, the blue is carbon dioxide. You can see this relationship between the level of CO2 and temperature. There is variability. Variability is important to understand, but it doesn't mask the signal, which is this astonishing relationship between carbon dioxide and global air temperatures. So then our question is, what we're going to look at today, when was the last time the Earth had 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Because if we can find out more about that world, we might find out about the world that we are going toward at the moment. We're already 1 degree warmer than we were in 1850, and we're more than 100 parts per million carbon dioxide greater than what we were in 1850. So we've done the switch. We've turned the oven on, and the oven's already warmed up by 1 degree centigrade, but it's not going to stop at that point. So what we're going to learn today is something about the world that we are inheriting for ourselves. We're going to go back in time into the Pliocene, 5.2 to 2.6 million years ago. So our speakers today, I'm really, really so pleased that they're all with us. Our first speaker will be Alan Hayward, who is a professor of geoscience and paleoclimate science at the University of Leeds. We then have Professor Dan Lunt, who is Professor of Climate Science at the University of Bristol. Professor Tina van der Vuurt, who is a sedimentologist and geochemist at Imperial College London. Professor Dame Jane Francis, who is the director of the British Antarctic Survey, and Professor Rob de Conto, who we're pleased to welcome over from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. We've got a variety of things to talk about. We're going to be talking about how we model the past. We're going to be looking at how we get measurements and data from the past, both offshore and onshore, and we're going to talk about what it really means for today as well. These people are going to speak for about half an hour each. Opportunity for a few questions, but very limited questions initially, and then we're going to gather everyone back together for a panel meeting where you can fire any question you like at them toward the end. We've got a focus which is on Antarctica, and there's good reasons to do that, because Antarctica is a very sensitive part of the planet, and so changes that go on Antarctica are obvious, but they also have global meaning as well. So our focus is on the southern continent. So please welcome join me in welcoming Alan Hayward. Thank you, Alan. Who's going to kick us off with our first talk. Oh, have we got the site? I probably have to do this as well. Sorry. Alan, over to you.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the nice introduction. It's always a pleasure to come and contribute to a Royal Meteorological Society event. And so my job this afternoon, essentially, is to try to set the scene for you a little bit before we delve into and discuss Antarctica in detail, which I will leave to my learned colleagues. So essentially, the subject of my talk today is how accessible is the Pliocene as a 400 ppm world, as a world in equilibrium with 400 ppmv. I'm going to be doing that from both a numerical modelling and geological reconstruction point of view, trying to merge what we learn from both of those together to give us a better idea about what might be going on. And so to do that, obviously, I've got to integrate material from a lot of different people. And so there are a large number of co-authors associated with this talk that I need to properly mention their contributions. So first thing, which Martin sort of talked about a little bit, is why past or paleoclimate. So paleo essentially just means the past. Well, if you hadn't already noticed by this point, the Earth appears to be running a bit of a temperature. And it's running a temperature because essentially of the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. One of the things we're trying to understand is what is the rate of change, what's the magnitude of change going to be like, and what's necessary, if you like, therefore, to try to mitigate and adapt to some of these changes which are inevitably already part of the system. And the point is that we've seen in the past some very large natural climate variations which have occurred. So what can we gain from an understanding of the past to give us an idea about what might happen in the future? And I think what I'd like to start off with here is the importance of prediction. I mean, when we think about mitigation and adaptation strategies in the face of climate change, much of this really is based on, almost all of it is based upon the quality of the underlying predictions. So if we don't have very good predictions in that sense, it's not very likely that we're necessarily going to have the right mitigation or adaptation strategies to confront and deal with global warming. So what I'm showing you here are some model results taking different scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. And one of the things I'd like to point out here is that obviously as you move further into the future, the spread in terms of what's happening in terms of the amount of warming is growing. That's partly an uncertainty in the forcings in terms of the CO2 forcing and the pathway that we're going to follow. But it is also a function of the fact that as we go further into the future, the models appear to become a little less consistent in terms of what they're simulating, these global climate models. So one of the things we want to do, since the future is the ultimate data-sparse environment, really, what we're trying to do is to get a better handle on how good or how well our current generation of models can predict large signals of climate change. And one of the things you can do, therefore, is to look at climate changes that have occurred in the geological past. And it's very important to do this. I mean, even thinking about some of the fundamental measures of the climate system that we talk about an awful lot. So if we take climate sensitivity, so there are lots of different flavors of climate sensitivity, but let's just think about perhaps Charney sensitivity, the instantaneous response, the response of temperature to an instantaneous doubling of CO2. If we know what the climate sensitivity actually is, that helps us to understand how much carbon dioxide can be put into the atmosphere if we want to avoid certain levels of climate change. So it's absolutely fundamental to know that. One of the things we're beginning to understand actually from the geological record is that climate sensitivity is not necessarily a constant, and I'm not going to talk very much about this because Dan Lunt's going to pick this up in his talk. So can we use actually also the paleo to tell us about something about how climate sensitivity may change as climate warms? And what does that mean in terms of thinking about stabilization scenarios for the future? And one of the things we're particularly interested in here in the context of the Pliocene is thinking about the way that the Pliocene might inform us about the long-term response of the Earth system to around about 400 ppmv of CO2. So what's the response in the long term? if we could stabilize around 400 parts per millivolume. This is important because there are lots of studies out there that show now the benefits of trying to stabilize at certain temperature thresholds. So in other words, if we can stop warming going up beyond 1.5 degrees and prevent it from getting to 2 degrees or, heaven forbid, getting to 3 degrees, then there are lots of studies out there which actually show that that's a wise, sensible, prudent thing to do in trying to make sure that some of the worst side effects associated with climate change don't actually occur. So if you think here about the difference between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees of warming in terms of the number of extreme temperature events that you might have, the effects on agricultural yields of different types of agriculture, then in each one of these cases it seems that essentially the negative effects are ameliorated if we manage to constrain the temperature to a lower degree of global warming. So here's a summary of what's been going on over the last 5 million years or so, which Martin did a nice job just sort of talking about this bit up here. But we've got a record that goes much further back in time than that. So this is going back to 5 million years into the geological past. And yes, as Martin pointed out, you can see there's a lot of variability in this record. But interestingly enough, as you get back to around about 2.5, 2.6, 2.7 million years ago, then you can see that things actually then start to change. That pattern of variability is different. You're not dealing with the massive amplitude changes that you see here during the Pliocene, the last couple of million years. You go into this sort of warmer, more stable kind of climate scenario that we've seen characterized by the Pliocene epoch itself. And so schematically, we might think about the broad-scale changes in the environment as something like this, crudely. So during one of the glacial stages of the last couple of million years, we'd have had major ice sheets centered over the northern hemisphere and, of course, over Antarctica as well. During an interglacial event in the last couple of million years, you would have had the ice probably restricted to Greenland and ice loss around the margins of Antarctica as well. But during the Pliocene, it's quite probable that at certain intervals of time we lost most, if not all, of the ice in the northern hemisphere, as well as changing ice around Antarctica as well. So we are moving back into quite a different regime in that climate, ice, sea level kind of story. So why do we focus so much on the Pliocene? Well, there are several good reasons for that. I've been studying this for 21 years and I haven't got bored. And the reason that I don't get bored is because there's a constant new supply of data which comes out, and it's as relevant, it's even more relevant today than it was when I started working on it 21 years ago. So we have an abundant geological data for the Pliocene in which to understand what's going on. Pliocene CO2 concentrations, as has already been mentioned, were almost the same as present day. The continents, we believed, were essentially in their modern positions, although I'm going to caveat that and say I'm going to come back to that in a little bit later on in the talk. And Pliocene ecosystems were the same as modern. Well, why is that important? Well, that's important because, of course, one of the ways that we try to reconstruct the Pliocene is by looking at the fossil record. So you see a species of plant in the fossil record, you relate that to where that species of plant grows in the modern environment. It gives you an idea about their environmental tolerances. If you've got a lot of extant species in the Pliocene, then you can make those correlations and relationships with more confidence. So what's the CO2 record during the Pliocene? Here's a summary from Alexei Fedorov, published in 2013. And he's just using lots of different techniques and showing data from lots of different techniques to get at the CO2 value back into the Pliocene, which is this part here. And it's quite noisy, is the answer. The truth is, we need a better understanding of the CO2 value at this time. We are getting that. In fact, at the American Geophysical Union, I was listening to a presentation by Tom Chalk, who's got a new record, thinking about the way to reconstruct CO2 for the Pliocene using boron isotopes. And I'm very pleased to say that he's come out with the value for a particular interval of the Pliocene that I study in great detail, which is exactly where I'd always assumed it to be in the context of all the model results. So I guess I don't have to rerun all of those models, which is kind of very helpful. So thank you, Tom, for that. But so we can see from this that essentially the CO2 range is here. but we can be normally dealing up with sort of 350 to 390. We can occasionally go beyond 400, and there are even intervals which could have been higher than that. So how do we know that it's kind of a good comparison for the future? Well, here's a summary plot from a paper which came out just recently in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And what this person did, essentially, with some help of the paleoclimate modelers, was to statistically relate the patterns of future climate change to model simulations of different geohistorical periods. So the Pliocene being one of them, the LGM being another, the last glacial maximum, the last interglacial, and the Eocene, which is even older than that. And he did that for different RCP, so different CO2 pathways, essentially, into the future. And one of the things that he found quite interesting was under RCP scenario 8.5, then the Pliocene, which is this line here, provides the best statistical match to the pattern of spatial temperature change that you would expect to get from that scenario. And it does that until this bifurcation point here, which is around about 2130, something like that, AD. If we follow RCP 4.5, then the Pliocene always remains the best geological analogue under that sort of scenario which is used. So it partly depends what we follow. I sincerely, we don't follow this for all of our sakes, and I hope it's actually lower than that. But nonetheless, the Pliocene here is statistically shown to be the best overall match. So how do we know so much about the Pliocene with which to inform our climate model simulations for this particular time? Well, for that, we have to thank the geologists who have, for decades, worked on painstaking reconstructions, site by site, painstaking geological reconstructions, to work out what was going on at this particular time. Decades and decades and decades of hard work, and I have to take my hat off to them for it. And they were able to put this information into sort of syntheses, which we can then use in numerical model simulations. So there is this project called PRISM, which is run out of the United States Geological Survey, and is one of the groups that have tried to do these sort of syntheses which have underpinned model simulations. So they give us an idea about what the topography was like around the world, what vegetation cover was like, what the sea surface temperatures may have been like, what the bottom water temperatures may have been like, and what the ice sheet extents may have looked like. And we can put all of that information into climate models, integrate them, and it can give us an indication of how much climate changes as a result of that. And here are some top-line kind of headlines from some of the geological findings. These are not model results, these are just geological interpretations, okay? So we have less sea ice in the high latitudes at this particular time, less land ice, so you have a higher sea level. I'm going to come back to that in a little while. Because of this, you have a reduced equator to pole temperature gradient, so the amount that your temperature is different, if you like, from your tropics to your high latitudes reduces in the Pliocene because you've lost a lot of ice in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. Ocean heat transport may have been different at this particular time. Upwelling zones in the oceans may have been warmer. ENSO, the variability of the El Niño Southern Oscillation, may have changed. And so these are just some of the sort of high-level features that we get from indications about ice and the ocean. We can do the same thing for the land. So here we have a summary for the vegetation for this particular point in time, done by a good friend and colleague of mine, Ulrich Salzman. So some of the main features that we see for this interval time are a reduced extent of arid deserts around the world. So the arid deserts seem to shrink during the Pliocene. We have a poleward shift in most biome types, most vegetation types. And in fact, one of the most interesting features of the reconstruction that we actually see is that tundra is almost completely gone from the northern hemisphere. All right? So today, at the Arctic coastline, you have tundra there as the basic vegetation. During the Pliocene, which is only about 3 million years ago, with only about 400 ppmv of CO2, you've lost all of that tundra, and you've got boreal forests outcropping at the Arctic coastline. Now, to do that, you need about 15 degrees of warming for 400 ppmv. The geologists are also able to tell us something about what happens in terms of ocean circulation by looking at various isotopes, so carbon isotopes and oxygen isotopes, neodymium isotopes. They can give us an idea about what happens to circulation. And so there are interesting suggestions, I think we'll probably put at the moment, about the way that northern component waters may have changed, the production of North Atlantic deep water, even things associated with circulation in the North Pacific may have been quite different back in the Pliocene. So the question is, how do the models do when we can confront them with all of this information? Well, there's been a major effort on the modeling side as well. So the first, I think, numerical simulation for the Pliocene came out in 1994 using full geological boundary conditions. But we've got to the point now where we have an international group of climate modelers who work on this interval of time. So we have, I think we have something like 23 different models now in use across 13 different modeling groups worldwide, who are carrying out coordinated experiments to try to understand this interval of time in the geological past. And this is the Pliomit project, which stands for Pliocene Model Intercomparison Project. And what we're trying to do with this project is to get an idea about where models are consistent in their simulations of the Pliocene, where models are not consistent, and so maybe we shouldn't have so much faith in their predictions. So here's some results from phase 1 of the Pliocene Model Intercomparison Project. I'm just going to show you, keep your eyes focused on the left side here, I think. So what I'm showing you here is an anomaly, the difference, the change in surface air temperature as an annual mean between the Pliocene and the pre-industrial era. Okay? So that's the surface air temperature, and we have the same thing here for sea surface temperature as well. And so what's some of the characteristics of the temperature change that occurred at this particular time? Well, you can see actually that there's warming in most latitudes across the Earth. That is quite muted in the tropics, but it becomes progressively amplified as you move into the high latitudes. There is a very clear polar amplification signal of the warming at this particular time. And you can sort of see a similar sort of pattern in the sea surface temperature changes that are predicted by the models as well. So why do the models simulate these changes? What's driving these changes? And we can get at that by performing things that are called energy balance analyses. So you can basically just try to decompose the various factors which are contributing to the warming at this particular time. And this was a paper that was done by Dan Hill back in 2014. So we've got the warming as a function of latitude. Here is that black line that we can see here. And we can see it decompose into the different factors that we're considering here. So the clear sky albedo, the greenhouse gas emissivity, and the cloud albedo, etc. And we can see essentially that as far as this analysis is concerned, one of the key things in creating that additional warmth that we get at the high latitudes is the clear sky albedo. So in effect, the changes in the surface albedo that are occurring in those latitudes during the Pliocene. Quickly followed up by greenhouse gas emissivity, so the greenhouse gas forcing itself. So that's a way of getting an idea of what's more or less important in driving the pattern of climate change at different latitudes. What's going on in terms of atmospheric circulation? Well, here's a result from Korvek and Fletcher, which was published in 2017, again using the Pliomit results. And what they're looking at here is the meridional mass stream function in the atmosphere. And what they're using it here in terms of coupled Pliocene simulations and fixed atmosphere-only simulations, what they're doing here is to try and get an idea and characterize the state of tropical circulation at this time. And one of the things that they see is that tropical circulation in the Pliocene tend to be weaker than they are in the pre-industrial. And that's actually quite similar to model predictions of future climate change. So we have a weakening in the Hadley circulation, which is also quite consistent with future climate change predictions. We have a weakening in some models in terms of the Walker circulation, although that's not particularly consistent across the models which are used in this particular ensemble. So there are major changes going on in the tropical circulation patterns. We can also see interesting indications of changes in tropical cyclones at this particular point in Earth history. So up here we have cyclone tracks with some information about intensities here. This is for the pre-industrial up here. And then we have two different Pliocene sort of simulations here relating to these different patterns of tropical sea surface temperature warming here. And I think one of the things that we see quite clearly is in the scenarios where we allow the tropics actually to warm up a little bit more than this particular scenario, we start to see an indication of a higher number and greater intensity tropical cyclones being predicted by this particular modelling framework. ENSO, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, is something which is studied in quite some detail. And I think, Chris, did I see you come in? Yeah. Where are you? There. There you are. So this is your paper. So Chris very kindly carried out an analysis of the El Niño Southern Oscillation from Climate 1 for us, and have just taking one of the plots from his 2015 paper in Climate of the Past. And what he's looking at here is ENSO amplitude change related to the change ENSO pattern correlation. So he's trying to actually see whether there's an overall clear pattern in the amplitude of ENSO events that are occurring in the Pliocene, and whether or not we're moving to kind of more La Niña-like or El Niño-like scenarios in this particular case. And I think one thing that you can see quite clearly in this pattern is that there is an indication of reduced ENSO amplitude for the Pliocene at this point in time. Although actually whether you're on the El Niño-like or the La Niña-like side of that spectrum really does sort of depend on which model that you choose. And that's actually a kind of a pattern that we have seen in future climate simulations as well. So that's something which is mirrored in that. One of the things that we also have to be a little bit careful about here, of course, is that we do know that there is centennial variability in ENSO. So one of the things that's actually quite useful is to look at the multi-centennial variability in ENSO in different models. And there you can see some slight different patterns, but I'm not going to go into the full details of that here. Sea ice. Major changes in sea ice, particularly here for the Arctic. So what I'm showing you here, this is for lots of different models are giving you an indication about sea ice extent through different months of the year. This one is for the pre-industrial era, and this one is for the Pliocene. Okay? And the spatial coverage of the ice are shown in these plots over here to the right. So what we're seeing essentially is obviously during the summer months you have less sea ice than you do during the winter months. That's kind of a relief in terms of what the models are doing. But note here that essentially in the Pliocene case, some of those models start to suggest that you had a seasonally sea ice-free Arctic Ocean during the Pliocene. Right? Now you may have heard that sort of thing being discussed in the context of the debate about future climate change. So here, again, here is another. How quickly could we get to a scenario in the Arctic which is seasonally sea ice-free? Well, some models say that we had it even under a 400 ppm world in the Pliocene. Not all of them, though. Interestingly enough, again, this is where models, sometimes when they're confronted with really quite different climate states than they're used to simulating, if you like, tend to find life a little bit more difficult in those sorts of situations. So yes, a lot of them, or more of them, say we have reduced sea ice in the warm Pliocene, but actually that spread in the prediction of the models when they're simulating that sea ice grows for the Pliocene as it does for the pre-industrial. So the models are less consistent in their simulations of Arctic sea ice for the Pliocene than they are for the pre-industrial. And so we can get an idea, and this actually sort of underlines partly the value of doing these sorts of paleo experiments to see how models perform. What about the great conveyor and the major features of ocean circulation at this time? Well, this is another area which has been looked at as part of the Climate project. So we have here a whole series of different climate models which are running for the pre-industrial and also for the mid-Pliocene here, looking at how much the overturning circulation in the North Atlantic may have changed in the Pliocene compared to the pre-industrial. And the basic answer here is that we don't have any clear indication of a major change in the overturning circulation in the North Atlantic. All right? So the models are not giving us a clear picture of what's going on in that regard. And this, again, is where we need our colleagues in the geoscience community to really apply their stuff to help us get a better idea, essentially, which members of this ensemble are doing more or less sensible things. It's a difficult problem. It's a really hard problem, but it's something that we need to continue to work on if we're going to try to crack that particular nut. So how well do models perform when we're thinking about that? So we do data model comparisons, and there's a lot of information on this plot. So here's latitude from the south, going up to the North Pole here, mean annual sea surface temperature anomaly here. And we have each one of the model's results here is a different color. And this big blue is the geological data. The big blue circle is the geological data. And we can get an idea, essentially, of how these different models are performing, whether they're overlapping with the data or they're not. They don't seem to overlap as you move towards the higher latitudes. And we can see a similar pattern, if you like, in terms of the terrestrial data here. Here's the terrestrial signal, and that's how far off the models are compared to the terrestrial pattern of warming. So models may be underestimating the magnitude of climate change at this particular point in time. But one of the things we have to be conscious of is that when we talk about the Pliocene, there is a temptation to think about it as one monolithic time period of 2.5 million years when nothing really changed. Well, that's clearly inaccurate. And as you saw earlier on, there was still variability going on all the way through that particular interval. And so the question then becomes, when exactly in the Pliocene are you modeling? And what exactly is the date of the geological information that you're comparing the models to? And those two things need to be consistent if you're going to take into account of orbital variability and things like that in the effect that that has on patterns of data model disagreement. It's also fundamental for thinking about things like how do the monsoons change at this particular point in time. So here's a couple of indices which we've put together for different Pliocene experiments. Each one indicates a different interval of time within the Pliocene. And we're looking at the Indian summer monsoon indices. And one of the things that we see here is actually the specific point in time that you're modeling in the context of the Pliocene is very important in determining what the monsoon behavior is predicted to actually be. So overall, one thing we need to continue to do is to continue to get access to higher and higher resolution geological data sets that enable us to resolve that kind of variability so that we can compare apples and apples rather than apples and oranges. Just skip this through. One of the big challenges for us at this particular interval of time is understanding what's going to go on with the ice sheets. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but because it's going to become the focus of talks which are going to come after me. But we have significant challenges here, and one of the things we try to do is to show the areas where we are more or less sure about the presence or absence of ice in the Pliocene. So this is work by Sebastian Koenig and also Aisling Dolan from previous papers, looking at Greenland, trying to get an idea essentially where models are more or less consistent in terms of their predictions of ice over Greenland. And we have the same thing here for Antarctica. And it's actually, as you're going to get, I think, as an indication from the talks that come afterwards, it's a really significant challenge, thinking about what the nature of the ice sheets were like at this particular time, how they varied, and whether or not models do a good job at reproducing those signals. And I think the uncertainty there is still quite significant. I just want to end just quickly by talking a little bit about paleogeography. So right at the beginning, I said, well, the continental positions were the same as the modern, so that makes it that's one of the reasons why it's a good analog. Well, one of the things that we've learned, essentially, through working with geodynamic modelers, so people who know about the crustal evolution of the planet over the last few million years, is that essentially some of our assumptions in terms of things being exactly the same may not have been that good. And I'm thinking about here a latest paleogeographic reconstruction we have for the Pliocene for about 3.2 million years ago, which actually has two important differences from the modern, well, several, but two I'm going to point out here in detail the closed Bering Strait and the closed connection to the Arctic through the Canadian archipelago. Now, interestingly enough, when you start to put those changes into the models and see what that does in terms of affecting the way that they simulate ocean circulation and regional temperature change, one of the things it enables them to do is to start to warm up the North Atlantic, which is one of those areas where the models weren't doing a particularly good job at matching the geological data. So maybe some of our assumptions of everything being the same in the context of the Pliocene in terms of gateways may not have been particularly fantastic. So in terms of the summary, the intervals of the Pliocene were definitely warmer than the pre-industrial. The hydrological cycle was enhanced. There's a clear pattern and the polar amplification of the warming. Potentially an ice-free Arctic Ocean during the summer. Strong indications of losses of ice from Greenland and Antarctica, but there's uncertainty there. And I think I wrote a little quote for something that I wrote recently, but I think it's kind of relevant to today. So after studying the Pliocene for 21 years, and all things being equal, and by that meaning that if I have a long few decades of life left to enjoy for myself in the future, all things being equal, I will experience firsthand a climate state that has not existed for more than 3 million years. So I will get to test these simulations, which will be extremely interesting from a scientific point of view. I sort of do hope that I'm wrong from a societal and personal point of view. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Alan, many thanks. Just great. We've got time for one or two quick questions. We're going to push a lot of questions toward the end, but if anyone has a burning question now on Alan's talk, please raise your hand. Great.
Oh, Dan.
What? Dan. Are you going to answer this in your next presentation? You're not.
Well, probably not this one. I'm hoping Alan will know the answer. So I just noticed when you showed the results from the Burke paper, the PNAS paper, and you said that it shows that the future is going to look very much like the Pliocene. It had the same figure, but for lots of individual models, and there seems to be a lot of difference between the different models. And I think I noticed for the GISS model, for example, instead it looked like it was going to be, the future was going to be like pre-industrial almost, or the mid-Holocene. I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on the sort of the different results that we get from different models and why that might be.
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, obviously that's one of the reasons why we do the Climate project, is to get an array of different model results. But, I mean, it does actually lead quite nicely onto what you're going to talk about next, which is really... So that was a gratuitous plug. But, so, you know, in the context of really trying to understand climate sensitivity and why different models have different climate sensitivities. So, you know, the fact is that climate sensitivity is not the same in all of the models, and that determines essentially how much warming that you get in response to a given forcing, CO2 forcing. And so what we're seeing in terms of the Burke paper is an expression of that, is that some models being more sensitive than others in that context. So that's always why you should never just use the results of one model too much. You need to get an idea about the uncertainty in that. And of course that's what Burke did. So he did take different models to address that particular issue, to his credit.
Okay, last question, please.
I was just wondering, it seemed in a lot of the confidence, talking about how confidently we can... it seemed that when you were talking about how confidently we could say something, it was multiple models and how well they agreed. But if there's one model that is inaccurate through something that we didn't know, for example, the positions of continents, as you were talking about before, and how something like that could affect the results, could one or two models that are very wrong, could that affect the overall models to be inconsistent, even if there are other models that are more accurate?
Good question.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So you're partly getting into a philosophical debate whether or not you should always keep models in an ensemble, and actually is there a quality threshold which is required for them to even be included in the ensemble? And that is a very interesting area. It's not something Well, I was about to say that we haven't done that. We have done that, actually. So we did that just recently in thinking about the degree to which the uncertainty in climate forcing affected ice sheet model predictions for Antarctica for this point in time. And we actually excluded it. We excluded one model on that basis, essentially because its simulation of the pre-industrial ice sheet was so far away from the observed ice sheet that essentially it just skewed the results of the ensemble. So yeah, you do have to think carefully about what your ensemble means actually look like, because they can be quite affected by the results of one particularly wild-looking model.
Good question.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, thank you, Alan. Alan Hayward, University of Leeds. Very good. Next speaker, loaded up his talk already, is Dan Luntz from the University of Bristol. Would you like Alan to ask you a question at the end as well? And sort that out for you. Okay.
Okay, so thanks very much, Martin. It's always nice to speak at the Royal Metsoc. The last talk I gave at the Metsoc was at the Northeast branch, I think, where I talked about the climate of Tolkien's Middle-earth. So this one will be a little bit more based in fact, hopefully. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Pliocene, and in particular what can we learn from the Pliocene about the future. I'm going to frame it very much in terms of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this is very much at the forefront of my mind at the moment. I've been involved in the forthcoming IPCC report, and it's really opened my mind to the many different ways that past climates can inform us about the future and can improve our predictions about the future. So I'm going to start off by just introducing a bit about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and talk about what they do and the framework and the sort of timescales that they work on. And then I'm going to talk about more generally about how the past can inform the future and the various different ways that can happen, and in particular sort of frame that in terms of the Pliocene, of course. And then I'm going to take one of those particular examples and develop that a bit further, and that is this idea that Alan introduced about climate sensitivity, so the amount of warming that we get given a certain forcing of CO2 in the atmosphere. And I'll talk about how the Pliocene can inform those estimates of climate sensitivity in various different ways and how they improve our understanding of that particular metric. And then I'll talk about some various different ways forward. So that's the plan. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, it started off in 1988. It was sort of proposed originally by the World Meteorological Organization, and the objective of this body is to provide governments at all levels and across all different nations with the information, the scientific information that they might need to make sensible and well-informed climate policy. So it's really, the purpose of it is not for scientists, it's not aimed at documenting everything that we know about climate science for climate scientists like myself or for teaching, although it is really useful for that. The main purpose of it is to inform policy. And so everything that is included in those reports at some point has to have relevance for policy. So if we're talking about past climates, we don't discuss them because we're interested in them, although that's the motivation for many of us. We're discussing them because there is some importance or relevance for the future. So that's what the IPCC does. It does that by assessing and evaluating climate science that has been published in the peer-reviewed literature. So they're not reviewing that, but they really do assess it. So they look in a lot of detail at the various different studies and what their strengths and weaknesses are, and they compare and contrast them, and they come out with some sort of summarizing overall assessment of what that overall different lines of evidence and body of knowledge are telling us about science, and then how that applies to impacts, future risks, and how we might, as society, adapt and mitigate that climate change as well. And there are 3 different working groups within the IPCC, working groups 1, 2, and 3. The first working group is really focusing on the physical basis of climate science. So that working group would almost be exactly the same if there were no humans on the planet. So it's really talking about what the climate science itself is saying. And then the other working groups talk more about the implications of that for society, so in terms of impacts and adaptation. I don't know if, I expect many of you have seen these reports. If you take just one of them, just one of the working groups, it's a book that is literally, I've got a copy of it on my desk at the moment at work, it's literally about that thick, and there are 3 of them, and they come out every 8 years or so, and each one is, each 8 years is not re-summarising that evidence, but it's actually adding to the body of evidence that we've got already. So if you add together all these reports over the last 30 or 40 years or so, then you get to about something that's about a book literally about that thick. So there's a huge amount of information there. And not only is there a huge amount of information, it's also been, there's a really strict and rigorous review process that goes into producing those reports. So they're written by climate scientists from across the world, but then they're reviewed not only by their fellow scientists, but also by governments and policymakers. And so there's a huge amount of review and scrutiny of those reports that goes on. So at the moment, where are we in that process at the moment? Well, the currently being written is the 6th version of this IPCC assessment report. It's due out in 2021. The first order draft of this report is due in 4 days. Okay, so there are many climate scientists all around the world who are frantically working on producing the first order draft of this next report, because they know that it's going to undergo this huge amount of scrutiny. So what's it going to look like? Well, I can give you sort of a sneak preview, if you like, in terms of the next report, what it's going to look like. This is the structure. It's going to have these 12 different chapters that look at these various different aspects of climate science and extreme events and that sort of thing. Now, this is very different to the last few reports. In terms of paleoclimate scientists, like many of the people who are speaking today, there used to be the case that there was a chapter that was dedicated to paleoclimate and what past climates could tell us about the future. And I think people thought that was quite a good thing, because it meant that, you know, we could really make sure that a lot of the paleoclimate science that we did made it into that report and could potentially influence, or not influence policy, inform policy, I should say. But, however, I think in practice, many people, many policymakers and other scientists perhaps outside the past climate world just ignored that chapter, I think, in a lot of cases. And this time round, it's very different in that they explicitly say that each chapter is expected to build on all available lines of evidence, including paleoclimate. So this time round, the past climates are going to inform and be sort of impregnated, if you like, throughout the whole report, and they're going to inform all these different sections. So I think that's a very positive thing, because it means that the past climates will have a lot more relevance in some senses. So that's a little bit, a sort of very quick introduction to this process and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm going to talk now, before we sort of come back to that, a little bit about, in general terms, how the past can inform the future, so how the past might be able to inform this IPCC process. And I think there are 4 key ways in which the past can inform the future. And Alan's sort of touched on many of these. The first is that past climates provide us with a window of ways in which the world can behave in a very different way to that we experience today and that the sort of historical record can tell us about. Now, in particular, if some of these past climates, the difference between that past climate and today is driven by the same sorts of changes that are going to cause changes to our planet in the future, so if the causes of change are very similar, then in that case, these past climates can act as an analogue or a window into our possible future. And that's what Alan was talking about when he said that the Pliocene can act as an analogue for the future. It's providing us a window into how our world might be in the future. So that's a sort of qualitative way that past climates can inform the future. But they can also inform us in a quantitative sense. And the first one of these is that if you go around the world and look at the future climate predictions, like the first slide that Alan showed, they are made by groups of climate models that have been developed at various different climate science and meteorological institutions around the world. Now, they're developed by climate scientists who, in general, know almost nothing about the deep climate history of our planet. In general, they're trained perhaps as physicists or meteorologists, and they just don't know about these past climates. And you might think that's a weakness, but actually I think that's a strength, because it means that when they're developing these models, that they can be tested sort of entirely independently of that development process by evaluating how well they perform under past climates. And so the geological data that we can obtain that tell us about how warm or how wet past climates have been are extremely valuable for evaluating how good our climate models are, because they're that data is almost completely independent of the data that's been used to sort of tune or develop our climate models. And in many cases, the sorts of worlds that we're looking at in the past, because they're a potential analogue for the future and they're caused by similar drivers, that makes that an even more relevant test for the future climate projections of these models. Now, another thing that past climates can do, that by looking at the magnitude of the forcings on climate, like CO2 change, and looking at the temperature response, they allow us to, again, say something quantitative about key climate metrics that are used, like climate sensitivity, and that's one that I'm going to come back to in a minute. Finally, again, another thing that Alan mentioned is that the past can tell us, because the past many of these past time periods, we look at them on time scales that are much longer than the sort of century scale that the IPCC often looks at. These climates can be really valuable in that they tell us something about the long-term future. A typical climate model these days, it will simulate about 3 to 5 years of future climate in about a day. Okay, so if you're doing a 100-year projection into the future, it's going to take you at least a month, if not longer. And so because of that, many of these climate models, they don't look at the really long-term future that past climates can, however, tell us about, because they're in equilibrium with these sort of large forcings that we have. So what I'm going to do is now look at a few of these examples of how the Pliocene in particular can inform the future. So the first of these was an analogue, a window into the future. So, and one of the things I said is that it could be an analogue for the future if the forcing, so what made the Pliocene warm, is similar to what might make our future warm. And to do this, this graph is probably my favourite figure in all of climate science. It shows, on the y-axis, is the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere on sort of a logarithmic scale, so it's something sort of proportional to the amount of the kick or the amount of forcing that this CO2 is applying to the climate system. And on the x-axis along here, we've got time, going back in time, but it's not a linear scale, it's a log scale. So as we go from the present day, which is just about here, we go back in time, we're getting faster and faster. Here's 1 million years, here's 50 million years, and then we go back to 500 million years right on the left-hand side of this plot. And just to orientate ourselves before we look at the data to sort of see where we are, well, here we are today in London, like I said, just over here. The pyramids were being built around here, about 4,500 years ago. We have the Neanderthals dying out in the last ice age, about here, 24,000 years ago. 800,000 years ago, the first stone tools were being developed. First stone tools that we have evidence for in the UK, just under 1 million years ago, about here. The Pliocene, here, 3 million years ago, Australopithecus afarensis, one of our ancestors at the time, is here 3 million years ago. Dinosaurs dying out just about here, 65 million years ago, and then we have the explosion of life in the Precambrian about here, 500 million years. Now, Martin showed this part of this figure, the last few ice age cycles going up and down. Here we are today with CO2 at about 400 parts per million, and you can see, this is a point that's been made, you have to go back about 3 million years before you find CO2 concentrations similar to that we have today. If you're talking about the end of this century, 100 years or so in the future, under business as usual scenarios, you actually have to go back about 50 million years till you find CO2 concentrations about that sort of level. But today we're talking here about the Pliocene, this sort of equilibrium world, with about 400 parts per million. So it's a good analogue for the future because the warmth that we had in the Pliocene was driven by something similar to what we're going to have in the future. And so when we look at geological reconstructions like this one of the amount of warming that we had in the Pliocene compared to the present day, this is potentially telling us something about the world of the future. So we have what we call polar amplification, and that there's more warming towards the higher latitudes than there is in the equator. On average, we think the world was probably about 3 degrees warmer than it was today. And like Martin said, the last ice age, to put that in context, the last ice age, where most of the UK was covered in a massive ice sheet about a kilometre thick, was only about 4 degrees cooler than it was today. So we're almost going like an ice age, again, warming into the future. Or the Pliocene, I should say. And then we have other things like pollen records that tell us something about how vegetation was different. And like Alan said, we have a shrinking of desert regions. We have a movement northwards of a lot of the vegetation types, almost removal of any sort of tundra-type vegetation as plants move and adapt to the warmer climates. And we also have evidence of higher sea levels at the time, perhaps as much as 20 metres, 10 to 20 metres higher sea level than we have today. And you know, I don't need to tell you about what that means in terms of implications for low-lying states and cities. So when we come to the Pliocene being an analogue, this is just an animation of a similar thing that Alan showed. This is from that Burke paper that we were talking about earlier. This is showing, here's the year going off into the future, 2060, 2070, 2080. The colours in the different regions are telling us which time period is the most similar to that temperature and precipitation that we have in the future. And you can see that by the time we get to sort of 2100, 2200, under this particular scenario, much of the world is looking very, very much like the Pliocene 3 million years ago. So that's a bit about the Pliocene as an analogue. We can also, like I said, learn something about the future by testing the models that we use to predict the future using data from the Pliocene, by setting up our models to try and simulate the Pliocene and asking the question, how well do they represent that geological data? So, for example, here is a plot from the last IPCC report which shows the amount of warming that we'd expect in the year 2100 over the oceans and over land. But the key question that policymakers want to know the answer to, and why they look to things like the IPCC report, is how good is this as a prediction? What are the uncertainties in it? So, well, in some ways, here's an answer, because if the Pliocene is telling us something about the future, here we have in the background estimates of how much warmer the Pliocene was compared to modern, with the in the circles, the amount of warming. In the background, we've got the average of several different models trying to simulate the same thing. And what came out of this is, although the models are doing a reasonably good job of simulating the average amount of warming that we get over the world, they are not doing a good job of simulating the amount of warming we get in the polar region. So they're underestimating sort of the amplification that the Earth system gives us in terms of that warming, in terms of extra warming in the higher latitudes, in the Arctic, and over Antarctica. So in some ways it's telling us that maybe our models are not sensitive enough to the forcings like the amount of CO2. And the same thing, basically a very similar story occurs when we look at temperature over land. So that's a little bit about those two aspects. The next thing I want to talk about is quantifying key metrics. So how past climates, and the Pliocene in particular, can tell us something about numbers or metrics that policymakers really want to know the answer to. And probably the most important metric in the whole of climate science, if you're going to boil climate science down to one number, and it's like almost the holy grail of climate science, you could argue, is this concept of climate sensitivity. So there's been probably more work done in climate science in trying to understand this number than any other number. And what it is defined as, it's the amount of warming that you get averaged over the whole globe if you were to double, if you're going to do sort of an imaginary thought experiment and suddenly double the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then let the system adjust to that additional CO2 in the atmosphere and see how much warming we got. Now, why is it such a high-profile metric? It's because it allows us to answer really important policy-relevant questions. So, for example, as you probably know, the various countries of the world signed up to agree at the Paris Agreement to attempt to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. Now, if you want to do that, you have to know how much CO2, that might all be very well, but what you really need to know is how much emissions we're going to burn or how much CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is going to give us that amount of warming. And so effectively what you need to know is the climate sensitivity, because given this 1.5 degrees, it allows you to know what the CO2 concentration we should aim at will be. Similarly, if you know that you're going to burn a certain amount of fossil fuel and the CO2 concentrations are going to reach a certain amount, this number allows you to work out what the climate change is going to be and therefore what the impacts are going to be. And so it's a number that is used not only in its own right, but it's also used as an input to many economic and impact type modelling. I went to a meeting in the States a few years ago. It was a meeting, sort of a joint meeting between economists and climate scientists, and it turned out that for the economists, they basically boiled all of climate science down to one number that was an input into their economic projections, and that number was climate sensitivity. So it's a very widely used number. It's also a very highly studied number. And there's been a huge amount of effort to characterise it over the years. The first efforts were actually in the late 1800s. Arrhenius made one of the first estimates. He estimates it to be somewhere between 5 and 6 degrees C warming for a doubling of CO2. And actually, amazingly, over the years, this first number, and then numbers by Hulbert, for example, 4 degrees C, it actually hasn't changed very much since then. If you look at the various different IPCC reports, they always provide what they call a likely range for this particular number. And since 1990, it was 1.5 to 4.5. In the last report, it was still 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. Okay, so there's still a large uncertainty in what this number should be. And so, you can see why narrowing those uncertainties might be really important. And there are many lines of evidence in the IPCC report that are used to inform this range, but I think it's fair to say that in the past, the paleoclimate has only been sort of very much a secondary input to this, characterising this uncertainty in this number. They tend instead to look at sort of process-based studies or look at the recent historical or instrumental record. But I think that paleoclimates potentially have a huge amount of information that they could give on this study, on this number, as we'll see. So how can the Pliocene inform this number? Well, there's a number of different ways. So the first is if we know how much CO2 there was in the atmosphere during the Pliocene and we know what the temperature was, you can just use those two numbers to tell us what we think the climate sensitivity was. That's potentially very, very powerful. That's what was done in this study. Here's a temperature record from about 3.3 to 2.3 million years ago. You can see these sort of orbital scale variations that Alan was talking about. And here's the CO2 changing at the same time. There's the background level. And so you can basically do almost a cross-correlation of these two. Look at the slope on that, and it's telling you something about what that sensitivity is. And if you do that, then you actually come up, and that's what they did in this paper, you end up with a sort of a tighter range than what you get from the IPCC, and it's slightly at the upper end of that. They came up with a likely range of 3.05 to 4.35 in this case, and the uncertainty there is basically associated with our uncertainties in the geological estimates of both the CO2 and the temperature. Another thing you can do is carry out pairs of simulations where you take many different climate models and you carry out simulations of the Pliocene and of the future, and you look at the relationship between those two, and you do exactly so. The question that you had earlier about how you might choose which models were the good models, this is something you can do exactly that in this case, because here we have a range of different models with their estimate of the Pliocene temperature on this axis and their estimate of the future climate sensitivity on this axis, and you find there's a correlation between those two things, so it gives you some sort of relationship between the two. But we know from the Pliocene where the actual observations for this x-axis are, so it allows you to then sort of reflect that about this line of correlation and then give you an estimate for what this equilibrium climate sensitivity should be. And again, that gives you a different likely range, but again, a likely range for this climate sensitivity. And then you can combine these. So this is purely illustrative. This is something I was just doing very quickly last night. So this is supposed to represent the IPCC estimate of climate sensitivity. It doesn't actually look like this. This is sort of the probability density on this axis and the climate sensitivity on here. In fact, it's got what we call a long tail distribution. So in fact, it looks something a bit more like this and comes down more sharply here. But just for sort of illustrative purposes, this is the IPCC sort of probability estimate of what climate sensitivity is. Here are those different estimates from the Pliocene using these two different methods. Now, it turns out if you combine these estimates statistically, then you end up with something that is much narrower than any of those individual estimates. And you can do that if these are independent estimates from each other. And they are in this case because, like I say, the paleoclimate information, this information from the Pliocene is not really being used currently by the IPCC to make this assessment. And so by using the Pliocene, the idea is that we'll be able to narrow the uncertainty on that range, and that will be really useful information for policymakers and for planning and in terms of stabilisation of what's a sensible CO2 concentration to stabilise at in the future. Okay, so the other thing that I said that the Pliocene can tell us about and past climates can tell us about is more longer term changes in climate. And what I said when I was talking about this climate sensitivity and this definition and the IPCC estimate in terms of this likely range, really what they're talking about is just what the climate sensitivity is going to be like on the time scale of a few hundred years. So the IPCC don't really consider the long-term commitment that we're making to temperature change on longer time scales. You know, our grandchildren's grandchildren going, if you like, many hundreds of years or even thousands of years into the future. What the CO2 emissions that we're doing today, what are they committing to us as a human race in the long-term future? Now, we know from the Pliocene that once we equilibrate with that CO2, we're going to start getting ice sheet melt, sea levels are going to rise, and that's going to give us additional warming in the climate system. We're going to get these changes in vegetation that also amplify that climate change and aren't taken into account in the current IPCC estimates of climate sensitivity. And so it's likely that our future is going to be even warmer in the long term than is predicted by our current state-of-the-art models. And this is something, again, that we've looked at. In this case, this is a prediction of the future. If we equilibrated, given a sort of doubling of atmospheric CO2, these might be the temperatures that the IPCC would predict that we've had. But if you include the additional warming that we get from those longer-term feedback, so the sort of millennial scale or multi-centennial commitment, then you're looking at something more like this. Based on the evidence that we have from the Pliocene, you will have this additional warming over Greenland and Antarctica associated with the melting of those ice sheets and the fact that you no longer have this reflective surface, but you have extra absorption of energy. We also have more warming in the tropics because of the expansion of vegetation into some of those desert regions. And in fact, we found that these long-term warming actually these extra feedbacks will increase that warming by up to 50%. So rather than climate sensitivity being 3 degrees C, in the long term you're talking about a warming of 4.5. And and when you remember that an ice age is 4 degrees, you're talking about 4 degrees on the global mean is a big number. Okay, so just to wrap things up, I thought I'd talk about a few things that are sort of coming online and various different ways forward. One of them Alan's talked about already, the fact that we've learned a huge amount from the Pliocene, but the Pliocene, as Alan said, is a long period of time. And work that's being led by Alan, in fact, and his group is really trying to narrow that focus. So maybe we'll have less geological data to have access to, but we'll have much more confidence that that geological data is relevant for the future. Because we'll be just talking about one shorter time period rather than averaging over a longer time scale. Also, in the past, much of our evidence from the Pliocene has come from a limited range of geological evidence, and there are much more what we call proxies for climate change, indirect estimates of temperature coming from new and exciting ways of analysing biologically and chemically some of those sediments that we have from the Pliocene that are giving us completely independent estimates of temperature and give us much more confidence in those, in our understanding of the past and therefore what that means about the future. Also, in terms of our models, they're always developing, and one of the two key developments that are ongoing at the moment is our models are getting finer and finer resolution. So the model works by covering the world in these various grid boxes, and those grid boxes are getting smaller and smaller. So our predictions are getting finer and finer scale and getting more and more robust. In addition, these models are incorporating more and more parts of the climate system. So a typical climate model now will begin to simulate things like changes in ice sheets and vegetation that they weren't before. And so they're becoming really models of the whole Earth system rather than just models of the atmosphere and ocean. Finally, I think it's fair to say that our approach to statistics as past climate scientists has been a little bit sort of fast and loose at times. And so again, another project that Alan's been spearheading is a collaboration between climate science and statisticians to try and do a much better job, rigorous job of comparing our models and the geological data in a more sort of statistically robust way. And so I think those are the things that we'll see sort of coming online over the next few years that are going to hopefully mean that the Pliocene is able to have even more to say about our potential future. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. Very good. Many thanks. Time for a couple of questions, maybe. Please.
Simon Burkett. I was on the high-level group for the 6th Global Environment Outlook, which published a couple of weeks ago. One of the presentations we saw in Nairobi was by the Nepalese government, who led a project in terms of temperature effects in the Hindu Kush. And if you look at these maps, they don't actually show much of an effect in the Hindu Kush. And they're reporting, or they're talking about doubling of temperature rise above 2,000 meters typically, and I guess accelerating. I don't know whether you could comment on what might happen there, which may be caused, of course, by black carbon. I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So one of the things that when you're talking about future projections and future projections from models, there's one sort of limiting factor in terms of the amount of detail, if you like, that they can give, and that is when going back to what I was talking about, the way that these models are formulated, if you like, by covering the world with these different these grid boxes, as we call them. So it's a little bit, imagine having a sphere which is the Earth, and then you cover it with a whole load of Lego bricks, like going up into the atmosphere and down into the ocean. Now, the climate model can't tell you anything about what's happening on a spatial scale that's smaller than one of these boxes. Now, ideally, you'd make your models such that those boxes were as tiny as possible. But ultimately, you can't make them infinitely small because the amount of computation that is required then, like literally the size of supercomputer that you need goes up exponentially as you increase that resolution. And as such, a typical climate model has got there's a finite resolution that you have. And so if you're talking about changes on the spatial scale of something like the Hindu Kush, it's just our global climate models at this stage at the moment are just not able to reproduce, make future projections at that level of detail. They can tell you something on the scale of the Tibetan Plateau or the Himalayas themselves or northern India or something like that. But going to a spatial scale smaller than that is very, very problematic. Now, there are regional models that we have where you zoom in on a particular area, and they also have something to say, but ultimately they don't sort of feed back on the large scale circulation, so they're still not an ideal way of addressing that problem. So I think it's fair to say that those regional changes are really, really important. But at the moment, with our current computational power that we've got, it's very difficult to answer.
We'll allow a quick response, if you like.
Just the Hindu Kush actually goes the whole length of the Himalaya and beyond, and it's about 1 billion people. So, and of course, it is fresh water for northern India. So it's a massive problem.
It's a very good point. Thank you very much. I think what we'll do, Dan, we'll leave it at that point. Round of applause to Dan, please. Thank you very much. And the final speaker, before we change for some refreshments, is Tina van der Veert from Imperial College. Thank you, Tina.
Right. Thanks, Martin, and thanks everybody for coming. And special thanks to Alan and Dan giving me the setup I was hoping for, because I'm down as one of the data people here. So I want to dive into a little bit more detail now and actually look at one of the issues we touched on quite a bit already, which is that of what happens to the big ice mass sitting on Antarctica during the Pliocene. And we'll do so by looking at the offshore sediment record. So we'll go on drill ships and kind of look what we can recover from the ocean and learn from that. We've seen this introductory slide a bunch of times now. You're all oriented now where the Pliocene is. We're sitting kind of above our model line of temperature, kind of hitting this RCP 4.5 line, then was talking about CO2 levels of 400 ppm, temperatures of 2 to 3.5 degrees warmer. So that's kind of taking the whole of the Pliocene. And when we think about global sea level now, and I know Rob DeConto is going to do that later on in a lot more detail, I just want to focus on the fact that, you know, in this box here, I kind of quoted, luckily, the same number Dan just gave you, 10 to 20 meters of sea level rise is what we probably think is our best estimate right now. But the reality is that that number is very uncertain, and it ranges actually from 0 to 40, and a lot of people are working hard on refining that. But I want to take you a little bit into the whys, and that's kind of looking actually at where sea level is coming from, and that's, of course, our polar ice sheets. So we have about 7 meters tied up in Greenland today. The question mark here kind of tells you probably that was gone in the Pliocene. We just assume that for now. And now we have Antarctica, and in Antarctica, I put down two numbers here, 5 meters and 53 meters. And they for the two different parts of Antarctica, and I want to use a little bit of time to kind of introduce those, because they will be becoming important for kind of various things which will come in my data and also later on in Rob's talk. So why do I give two numbers? It's because when we think about ice sheets in Antarctica, there's two fundamentally different setups. There's kind of ice which rests on continent which is elevated, or on the continent which is elevated about sea level. So that's on the right-hand side here, what we call a continental-based ice sheet. And then we have ice which is resting on bedrock suppressed below sea level. So that's what we call a marine-based ice sheet. In kind of simple terms, you can think about, or people have for a long time actually thought about East Antarctica as mainly being a continental-based ice sheet, and West Antarctica being marine-based. In the context of global warming, that matters, because it's a lot easier to kind of eat into a marine-based ice sheet. If you kind of warm your ocean, if you kind of start bringing warm water under this ice shelf in the cavities under the ice, you can actually eat away this ice sheet and collapse it a lot more readily, and that's a process called marine ice sheet instability, particularly when you sit on a retrograde slope. So, why am I going on about that? This is a map in the top-down corner here, which is showing you the sub-ice topography of Antarctica. And the blue colors on there are the areas which are below sea level if you lift away all the ice. So what you see is that most of West Antarctica, the areas which are melting fastest today, are areas situated below sea level. So that's where some of that melting of the warm waters probably has already started. A lot of East Antarctica is sitting above sea level, but you can see highlighted, and I put some boxes around that. There's huge areas which are deep subglacial basins as well. And the ones I want to talk about from a data point of view today are the Wilkes subglacial basin and the Aurora subglacial basin over here, but there's another one up here, the Recovery Basin. And if you add up all of these, we're looking at something like 19 meters worth of sea level equivalent. So that's actually a huge amount of water tied up. West Antarctica, in comparison, kind of 3, maybe 4 meters. So we're talking really a big player here, which has to be considered as well. A fun project, I thought, I don't know whether any of you saw it. I actually didn't see it, but it happened here in London 7 years ago now, where artists put like LED lights around a lot of our landmarks at the height of 28 meters. And it was at the time to raise awareness of potential sea level 1,000 years into the future, in the year 3012. And if you think about these 28 meters, that's kind of Greenland and West Antarctica and, you know, the marine-based parts of East Antarctica. That's actually not far off. So just kind of keep that picture with you and something which is not far away from the Pliocene when you think about where the water would be here in London for all of us. Right, so the approach I'm going to take is, as I said, I'm going to take you on ships going south now, because that's what I like to do. We then will look at a bit of the geochemistry of the sediment. Don't worry, I'm not going to do too much detail on that one. And then we're going to think about what that tells us about ice sheet history. And I picked 3 examples here to give a little bit of an overview. We'll start off in the Ross Sea, which is this area down here. And we'll look at kind of the marine sediment record from this area and a record in the mountain range, which is here, the Transantarctic Mountains. We'll then move over to Pritz Bay to look at a drill site offshore here. But what it's actually going to tell us is the story of what happens in this marine subglacial basin over here. And then, last but not least, I'm going to move down to the Delhi coast to look at the Wilkes subglacial basin. So let's get going on the Ross Sea. And this is actually not going on ships. This is doing something quite innovative, which is putting kind of drill rigs on floating ice platforms. So I'm going to show that visually in this slide here. So this is a slide from the so-called ANDRIL program, the Antarctic Geological Drilling, which took place more than 10 years ago now, the years 2006 and 2007. They had 2 field seasons in Antarctica, and instead of taking a ship down there and trying to get a sediment record, which could sometimes be quite hard to do, they put a drill rig on a floating ice shelf, which was moving at the time as well, so really fascinating bit of engineering there. Kind of drill through the ice, go through the water, and then recover 2 more than 1 kilometer long sediment cores from below the seafloor. The first one mainly looked at the Pliocene history, so what we're talking about today. The second one was a bit older in time for the Miocene. So what did they come back with? I would say actually a lot of evidence which changed kind of the way we're thinking about how Antarctica kind of lost its ice. So here's some of the kind of sedimentary columns. That's what you do when you get fresh sediments. The most important thing is to describe it well. And we mainly have kind of 3 colors in this column here. And I want to start off with the yellow ones because they kind of the really important packages to look at. This record here is kind of across the Pliocene and Pleistocene. And these yellow packages are so-called diatomites. And they are areas which basically indicate that there was no major sea ice cover in the area. Remember, it's a drill site situated underneath ice today. So it brings us back to times where you had huge packages deposited of this stuff here. And as shown by the cartoon here, you could basically think about it like putting the drill rig on the surface of the ocean on a floating mat of algae. That's what was deposited at the time. And at the bottom, you can see the modeled version of what the Antarctic ice sheet would look like at that time. You would have no ice shelf in the Ross Sea, and since that's buttressing the Western Arctic ice sheet next to it, you have a collapsed ice sheet situation there. The other kind of intervals found are the mudstones. That looks more like the modern setup, and here you can see kind of the modern Antarctic ice sheet. And then, of course, you had times, even back in the Pliocene, where it was colder than today as well. So you had times where you have these diamictites, and you can see here the drill rig now submerged under kind of a lot of ice. So you had grounded ice at the position of the drill site. So you basically cycled back and forth between more extended ice, more retreated ice, in a very strong cyclicity during the Pliocene, indicating that all of these options happened multiple times. An interesting observation from these records is, and further work then on some of the organic geochemistry and the exact assemblage of the microfossils, is that zooming into this period here, and this is still staying actually in Alan's favorite part of the Pliocene, when we go to the mid-Pliocene period, around 3.3 million years ago, and I will come back and back to a number which is similar to that. Something changed around Antarctica. So Pliocene, it's a statement you heard before, is not like equal to Pliocene. The earlier parts of the Pliocene, from 5 to 3.5 million years or so, were definitely more warm and consistent. And in Antarctica, you start seeing then some evidence for cooling towards the mid-Pliocene, actually, not even the very end of the Pliocene. So I want to keep that thought in your head and take you actually from the ocean, so that's where the marine andril site is, to the mountains right next to it, an area kind of where Jane is going to take us in her talk. But I will look at a drill core, which was also done from a drill rig on the ice here, the Cirrus 2 core in the 1980s. And something kind of my student and I got interested in and revisited. So we thought, okay, what do the outlet glaciers coming down these mountains look like? Because they actually connected to the big eastern Arctic ice sheet. So you can, like, within a very short amount of space, monitor a bit what East and Western Arctic are doing. So we went to New Zealand, kind of sampled these cores, which are still preserved there. And you can see here schematically what the deposition of 160 meters of sediments looked like over the last 4.5 million years here. And you again have these diamictites, glacial deposits. You have some sandstones in this particular core. But what we really wanted to focus on is these mudstones. They kind of the grayish layers here. And you can already see a bit thicker in the earlier parts of the Pliocene, and then they become a bit thinner. But other than that, there's relatively little in the lithology to tell us what has happened. So that was the case where you have to actually take the sediment and do geochemical analysis. And what we take advantage of when we do that is that geology on continents changes. That's a really good thing. Not all rocks are the same. So that means you can use geochemistry like a DNA or a fingerprint and figure out where stuff was eroded from. So when you go up a valley, like this particular valley here, in this case, the top of the mountains actually are made of different material than the bottom. So we are hoping we could pick up some of that. And here's kind of the results shown in graphical form now, because we indeed did. That's the bottom line. So the earlier parts of the Pliocene tell us, in terms of the chemical fingerprint, that what was eroded was really kind of up the valley, up kind of at the height of the mountains in the Flora Glacier. And that probably means that our glacier, which today reaches all the way and puts its toes in the water in the Ross Sea, was restrained to the top of the mountains. Moving further then into the late Pliocene, and that's sediments in this case younger than 3 million years ago, we start seeing a signature which is definitely a mixture of all of these areas. So the glacier was still like wet base, it was still eroding, but it was eroding all from the top of the mountains to the bottom now. And if we would then go to the Holocene, the present day, you would actually only see a signature of that bottom part of the valley. So we definitely see a change there. We see an expansion in the eastern Arctic mountain glaciers, and that expansion coincides with what we found in this andril core in the Ross Sea and a cooling around 3 million years ago. So that's the first example from the Ross Sea. Let's move kind of a little bit around the continent. We started here and go over to an area called Prince Bay now. So this kind of sediment core recovered by ocean drilling in the year 2000. It's actually the first one I started working on more than 15 years ago now. And the story I want to tell you, however, takes us really down to this area. And that's why I threw in another slide here, DSTP Left 28, which is like the earliest days of ocean drilling, drilled with this ship here, the Glover Challenger. So that goes back to the 1970s, really. Old material, still really useful for science. I just want to make a quick point with this cartoon, that when I talked to you about like the signals we see in the geochemistry and the mudstones, we're talking about really kind of fine stuff being washed out from underneath the glacier, right? So you can kind of see that being deposited as a mudstone, and you can analyze that. However, there's another archive we can use, and that's kind of the stuff that gets eroded and transported out into the ocean in the coarser material in form of ice raft debris. So you can see here these icebergs, when they carve off an ice shelf, they carry detritus, and typically it's the local detritus. But since these bergs are transported by ocean currents, it sometimes can be from quite far away as well. So you can use one drill site to learn something about somewhere quite far away. And that's exactly what we're going to try to do now. So up here is our drill site, ODP site 1165 of Prince Bay. And I want to give you a very brief, and it says at that level, outline of the geology of the area. You have basically 3 different compartments here. You have the Pritz Bay area, which is kind of really old, 500 million year old rocks. You then move eastwards into this Wilkes Land area. You can see in the turquoise color, quite different ages, 11 to 1300 million years. And then down here is some of the oldest, biggest rocks on Antarctica in the Adelie coast. The craton there is actually 2 to 3 billion years old, but even the last overprint ages are 1500 years. So why am I talking geology here now? Because that's kind of the fingerprint we can trace offshore. We can see now, if we look at all these sites where we have pie charts, this is where we looked at modern core-top sediments. And if you compare their signature here with what you find on land, you can see this neat 500 million year peak in Pritz Bay, an older one at this Wilkes Land margin, and an even older one at the Adelie coast. So it really works well for fingerprinting where material is coming from. So that's the modern at site 1165. Going back into the past, as I said, the one thing we should keep in mind going into the Pliocene now is that this is your coastal current. So it's driven by the katabatic winds blowing off the ice sheet and would pick up any icebergs and transport them counterclockwise around Antarctica. So basically everything down here becomes a potential source area as well. So here's our results, and this is again just reiterating the modern data I just showed you. So when you look at the data from the Pritz Bay sector, they reflected in this 500 million year peak, just to get your eye into it. At the data further east from the Wilkes Land sector would plot here, modern data. So we draw a line under that and move now to the Pliocene. And this is the results from just one single site across like many different samples in the Pliocene. We analyzed more than 650 individual grains, so there's lots amount of data going into this. And what you can see now is 2 distinct age peaks. And you will say, well, that's just what I saw at the top. Yeah, but wait a minute. At the top, we looked at like 2 different areas. Now this is one core site, but back in time. So clearly, something changed. Your modern age peak, which sits here, gained like a secondary peak. And what that very much looked like to us was that you start getting icebergs traveling all the way from the area over here to our side. So we wanted to test that idea, and that's where some of these additional older sites come in. We analyzed another site in this area, and actually the only existing material offshore the Aurora subglacial basin available at the moment, one of these really old cores from the 1970s. And sure enough, if you analyze sediment of Pliocene age there, you still see these same 2 peaks. So that's the fingerprint of the Pliocene Aurora basin. That's the fingerprint of the Pliocene Pritz Bay area. That's what you see on one side. So you clearly have indication of the material coming over. And I just put it graphically here now. The Aurora subglacial basin is one of these big subglacial basins. And what we see at ODP site 1165 is that material in the Pliocene, under warmer conditions than today, made it all the way over there. So you must have an unstable ice margin. You must produce a lot of icebergs. And taking up the sea surface temperatures back then were even warmer than they are today, and you probably melted a lot of icebergs on the way. That kind of makes the signal even bigger. Interesting in that respect is, if we think back about that number I keep mentioning, 3.2 million years ago, when things started cooling, we see that cooling in the surface waters in this area as well. And what it actually does, it gives us more of a signature from this area. You would expect probably less because it gets cooler, more stable, but no, it gets cooler, less icebergs melt. So you actually get more of the signal. So sometimes you have to think a little bit around corners. But there's strong evidence that the Aurora subglacial basin was really unstable. What we really want to do is drill in front of the Aurora subglacial basin. I think that's one of the proposals I'm going to push in the future because it's one of the areas where we need more data. But we did that with the other big subglacial basin, the Wilkes subglacial basin. And that was an IODP expedition nearly 10 years ago now I was involved with. And I want to show you some data from that now. because that really changed, again, a lot of the agenda on how we think about these big subglacial basins in the Eastern Arctic ice sheet. Here's some of the data from the warm part of the Pliocene. So for me, that often starts at 3.3 million years, going to 5.2. So we leave out the middle and kind of later parts of the Pliocene here. And wherever you have these kind of pink bands marks warm periods. And I'm not going to bore you with the details here. You can see these warm intervals in the composition of the sediment. You can see it in the geochemistry of the sediment. You can see it in the physical properties. And you can also see it in the isotopic fingerprint. So this is, again, this kind of fingerprint of the geology we like to analyze in my group. And you can see here 2 lines wiggling back and forth. And it doesn't quite matter what they are in detail. They're, neodymium and strontium isotope systems, for those of you who want to know. But they do so in defined boundaries. What does that mean? So I just want to give you one glimpse at the detective stories we kind of have to do in our group when we try to solve stories like that. You actually have to start putting together a geological map of the area you're interested in, kind of color in your different bedrocks. Then you have to characterize these bedrocks for their chemical fingerprint. So that's done in a cross plot here of 2 chemical properties. And if you're really lucky, they form nicely distinct bubbles, like these ones do, because that means you can then trace when your material is coming from one or the other. Very often they nastily overlap, and then life is not so easy. So if we plot on top our Pliocene sediments here, that's the sediments from the cold times, in the blue bubble here. The grey dots are the sediments from the warm times. So they're clearly distinct, overlapping with different types of lithologies. So what does that mean? Let's zoom in, and I'll show you a little cartoon. So when we think about the colder times in the Pliocene on that side, that's the situation we envision. So our side sees this blue color, which is basically local kind of granitic rocks, which are exposed around the Ninnis Glacier, which is connected to a deep trough in the Wilkes subglacial basin, the Western Basin. And that's probably where most of the kind of erosion was happening. That's what you see today. Actually, today, most of the shelf is colored in by that signature. During colder times in the Pliocene, ice even advanced to the outer shelf here. We know that from some of the other drill cores from that expedition. So the cold Pliocene either looked like today or was more advanced ice. That's kind of what we learned there. What about the warm times, the kind of interglacial times in the Pliocene? Well, here we get a very different picture now. Our entire shelf is now colored in green, and that means we tap into a different bedrock source. Green around the coast is really rarely exposed. There's little spots, but we know actually from airborne geophysical observation that underneath the vast ice sheet in that basin, that green color, that particular lithology of the Devonian to kind of Cretaceous volcanic rocks and associated sandstones is present everywhere. And if you retreat the ice sheet, that's what you tap in and can erode. So you really, really need to retreat the ice from the margin, and then you open up these deep conduits, bringing out the meltwater to the shelf and feeding into your side. So the bottom line here is what kind of this paper, which was published in 2013, really showed, and I think convinced a lot of the people who were tied in this old debate about whether the Eastern Arctic ice sheet is stable or whether it's dynamic. It's like, well, it's dynamic. We choose that word very deliberately in our paper title, and I stand by it. The Pliocene ice margin was coming and going at a quite incredible signal, and also pace. So pace is, of course, the next thing now. We really want to know how quick do these things happen. And I have to say, this is where we're a little bit limited looking at marine sediments. We can't do annual resolution or seasonal resolution or whatever we want to think about if we think about rates of change, right? We can't do seasons back in the Pliocene. It would be lovely if we could. So most of these sediment cores give us the option to resolve thousands of years. Sometimes we can do better, but in these particular locations, we're glad if we can do thousands of years. So we were looking for the answer, how quick this ice retreat was going. And I'm not going to talk you through the details of this graph. I'm just going to leave you with the headline there, which is that kind of looking at the changes in our sediment data compared to some of the other data, we can say it's a few thousand years. I just randomly picked 2 of these warm times from the Pliocene. I could have picked a lot of others. We've analyzed quite a few of them now. But the retreat takes a few thousand years to be completed. And that is actually in agreement with some of the modeling work which is published today as well. All right, so that gets me to the end. And to wrap up, what we learned about Pliocene and Arctic ice was seen from marine sediments. In the Ross Sea, we can see that the western Arctic ice sheet was collapsed at times, and that outlets from the eastern Arctic ice sheet were retreated. That all transitioned into a slightly different system towards the later parts of the Pliocene. From records in the Prince Bay, we see strong indication of collapse of the Roer subglacial basin during the Pliocene, one of the major subglacial basins in eastern Arctica. And from the Delhi land, we see that another one, the Wilkes subglacial basin, also seemed to be very dynamic during this time. So I think there's a lot of data evidence accumulating now showing us that eastern Arctica was not stable. There's a lot of potential for eastern Arctica to lose mass. That was the absence of knowing sea level exactly. It's really important to go to these places and get the records from right next to where we think the change may happen. And I want to leave you with a little bit of a cartoon which kind of should make us all think and has been echoed by something said by the other speakers already as well. If we plot global sea level versus changes in mean temperature, I just drew in some boxes here without uncertainties, and we can argue forever about the exact numbers, where the Pliocene sits, where some of the last interglacials of the Pleistocene sit. This is kind of the trajectory where things go, right? If you change temperature, ice is going to melt. There's very little doubt about it. We can argue how quick this is going to happen, but this is happening. This is, of course, our projections for the year 2100 of the IPCC report, and both Alan and Dan said that as well. I think the paleoclimate data really urge us to not stop thinking at the year 2100, even if that's the end of our lifetime and even maybe that of our kids. You know, there is life beyond 2100, we all hope, and there's a future we should all care for. And with this, I want to...
Thank you, Tina. Very good. Time for a quick question or two. Yeah, I know everyone wants a cup of coffee. Me too. But what I would say, I mean, it's very, Tina's very nice presentation on these sediment cores. You have really no idea how difficult it is to get this material. And you know, what's frustrating, might be apparently frustrating, is that actually this is a wonderful description of what has happened in Antarctica from essentially 3 dots, right? 3 dots in the sediment, which is so valuable to get. I mean, it would be fantastic if we were able to get like a transect of what possibility is there of doing that, getting sort of 4 or 5 dots between, say, Wilkes and Prince Bay. Is that likely at all?
I didn't have this in here. So this is the history of Antarctic drilling.
Yeah.
That's
it, isn't it?
We actually pushed for it. The whole community pushed for it, right? And it has happened. Rob is nodding. It's like some people worked really hard to make this happen. So between the Prince Bay drilling I talked about in the year 2000 and the Adelie Coast one in 2010, there was 10 years. And that was the typical time span because it's logistically so hard to take ships down there. The conditions are not great. You never quite know what you get. It was hard to convince the program to invest the money to bring the ship down there and get these records more often. But I think particularly this Wilkes Land expedition has brought out such a wealth of information that we could push. We went back to the Ross Sea. I was on that expedition last year, so there's no results I can show you yet. But there's 2 students in the audience working on this right now. And earlier this year, the Amundsen Sea, there's a D missing, sailed. And right now, Iceberg Alley is out. So basically, within the space of 1 year, we could schedule in 3 expeditions. So that is unprecedented, and we hope we can continue pushing in that direction. There's clear gaps still on the map.
I have a question here.
How much does it actually cost to acquire a
Good question. That's a good question. How much does it cost?
Did you look at the budget, Rob, of the recently submitted proposal? Oh dear, it's millions of pounds.
Because you don't buy the ship either, right? So
Yeah.
I mean, you're not even paying for
The
that.
ship time is about 50K per day or something like that.
So the science plan that they're operating under now was written for 10 years, and it was roughly a $2 billion budget. So a ship, a ship that is like ice strengthened. So like Tina's out on a ship that shouldn't be there because it's not ice strengthened, and they have to watch icebergs. And every time an iceberg comes too close, they have to pull the drill string, out of kilometers of the seafloor and move out of the way. I remember at one point there was something on the table to build a dedicated ship to do this kind of work, and there you're looking at about $1 billion in terms of the equipment. So $2 billion for a 10-year program with the existing infrastructure for ballpark number.
There you go. Good question. Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Tina, as well. Wonderful. Sets this up very nicely for the final two talks, which we're going to take after a break. Time now. What is the time now? 10 to? Well, it doesn't matter. We're going to reconvene at 20 minutes past 4 o'clock. So come back in here at 20 past, and we'll be prompt. Thank you very much. My mic's getting turned on. Thank you very much. If we can take our seats. You've got one. You'll have one there. Yeah. Okay. Do that. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed your cup of tea and nice chat. Our fourth speaker is Dame Jane Francis, Director of the British Antarctic Survey and a person who's been in Antarctica many times, paleobotanist. And we're going to move from the offshore, where we were with Tina, and we're moving onto the land to think about what happened on the continent of Antarctica during the Pliocene. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you. Now for something slightly different, I think. So this is Antarctica today that you will know about. I'm going to take you back, actually, when Antarctica was getting greener, or was greener, and then, but actually first I'm going to start from a long time ago and come forward. So Antarctica today is covered with ice sheets, very thick ice sheets. But actually, there are some pieces of rock, they stick out on the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, on small islands, and then there are these, this is the Transantarctic Mountains through here, and there are the nunataks, the tops of mountains stick out. And where there are rocks, on the whole, these rocks contain fossil plants, believe it or not. And they're quite common in Antarctica. I always say if a spaceship landed in Antarctica and a spaceman from Mars came out, I think I could probably guarantee that he could find a piece of fossil wood within an hour on many of these rocks, because they do represent terrestrial environments that happened on this continent millions of years ago. And so you can find plant fossils that tell you about Antarctica in the past. And this is a place where I've normally worked on Cretaceous plants, and you can see very good exposure of rocks, 100% exposure. There's no grass, there's no buildings, and it's easy to find fossil plants. Now, I'm going to talk to you about in the Pliocene, so 3 to 5 million years ago, when there were plants on Antarctica. But to do that, when I've done that before, people have said, what do you mean plants in Antarctica? Are they relatives of the plants that are here on Antarctica today? And the answer is no, they're not. There are only a few mosses and lichens today and a couple of vascular plants. But millions of years ago, Antarctica was green and it had a lot of fossils. And the Pliocene fossils that I'm going to show you are not related to modern day plants in Antarctica. They're related to things that grew in Antarctica millions of years ago. So to be able to understand about the plants I'm going to show you in the Pliocene, I've got to go backwards and start 100 million years ago, and then I'll show you how the Pliocene fits into that. So here's a paleogeography map, the whole Earth, showing the location of the continents 100 million years ago, and you can recognise where they are, more or less. Actually, this is a really interesting compilation, a paleogeography map, because it's of the Cretaceous, 100 million years ago when dinosaurs lived in Antarctica, and you can see that there's probably very little ice on Antarctica, and you can see where the globally high sea levels drowned a lot of the continental shapes. So if you see all this pale blue here, you can see the outline, say, of Africa today, but these pale blue areas are the shelf areas, the shallow shelf areas where higher sea levels have drowned the continental shelf. And this may be what our world will look like when global carbon dioxide levels really melt a lot of ice on Earth, and you'll see how little land area there is left, but I digress. The most important thing about this diagram to understand is that from about 100 million years ago, time of the dinosaurs, Antarctica was a continent over the South Pole. Before that, it moved around in plate tectonics and was over the equator at some point and moved around. But from 100 million years ago, Antarctica was a continent over the South Pole, at times joined to South America and to Australia, but it stayed there ever since. And so what it means is, that's really important, because what it means is the kind of fossil plants that we find in Antarctica reflect the temperature and the climates in Antarctica at that time. They don't reflect the movements of the plates and of the continents, which people sometimes think they do. And what we find in Antarctica at that time is we find a lot of evidence for fossil plants. So Antarctica was green and it was covered in forests 100 million years ago. So for example, in the Cretaceous, time of the dinosaurs, you get these sediments here. Here's Jodie Howe, who's a PhD student studying fossil plants, and I always have to say Jodie is a normal-sized person. So this is a tree trunk. It is a huge tree trunk, not a small tree trunk, a huge tree trunk that, and it, in its position of growth about 100 million years ago. Here it is another one, so there's a fossil soil in the rock sequence here, a large tree trunk here, it's petrified, it's turned to stone, but it's a record of forests that grew in Antarctica 100 million years ago. And there are also, in the rock records, there are imprints of leaves in the rock record, there is more petrified wood here, and there's a fantastic sequence of pollen and spores, and we use those plant fossils to reconstruct the environments in the vegetation millions of years ago. So here's a fern here, you can see, a fossil fern, very similar to a modern fern that lives in the southern hemisphere today, and it probably looked like a tree fern like that. And we see fossils like this, so here's a rock nodule with lots of leaves embedded in it, and this is almost identical to monkey puzzle trees that live in Chile today in the high Andes. And they lived in Antarctica. And so putting it all together, so we'll start now from time of the dinosaurs, 100 million years ago. This is what an Antarctic forest looked like then, painted by an artist called Robert Nichols. And all of these plants are in the places that Jodie measured them. So she measured where those in situ tree stumps grew, and she measured the distance apart, she measured all the different plants. And so you can see a very lush forest with ginkgo, with monkey puzzle trees, southern hemisphere conifers, some plants that went extinct, ferns and cycads and mosses and lichens. No flowering plants 100 million years ago. And I think some of you might have heard my talk before, but so I can see some of you have spotted. So when Rob painted the artist is Robert Nichols. I asked him if he'd paint two little eyes down here because there's no animals here. And he said, yes, I have. I put you an animal in this painting. And he's camouflaged it. So can you see where it is? So we have found fossils, not of animals, not here, but if in different places, and there he is there. So there's a dinosaur here. There he is over there. So camouflaged. This is a herbivorous ornithopod, a small dinosaur that lived across Gondwanan continents at this time. So there were dinosaurs living in green forests in Antarctica 100 million years ago. Eventually, angiosperms, the flowering plants, evolved. And so what we're looking at really in the suite of fossils that we find, we see that the ancestors of the southern hemisphere vegetation. So when I show you Pliocene plants, they are not relatives of modern today. They're relatives of this kind of vegetation, the southern hemisphere vegetation in southern hemisphere. So here's another artist that we work with, James Mackay. So we've gone on a little bit in time now, 70 million years ago. This is just before the dinosaurs died out. So Antarctica, the Antarctic Peninsula, probably looked like this. So this is deliberately made to look like the Andes because I think it probably did. And you can see there's monkey puzzle trees up on the high Andes. You can see these are southern beech trees, which is very common in the southern hemisphere today. They're like beech trees, but they're a different kind of genus, southern beech. You can see there's some red flowers there. These are Proteaceae. And then there's different kinds of plants that had flowers and much more lush vegetation with flowering plants. And on here, he's also put on all the dinosaurs that my American and Argentine colleagues have found through the bones. So we've got sauropods here. We've got the hadrosaurs over here, something that looks like a Tyrannosaurus type. There's the armoured dinosaurs, and we had ducks. We've got duck fossils and primitive bird-type fossils. So a very lush and a lush green environment at that time. Warm climates. I think personally there was a little bit of ice in the centre of Antarctica at that time, but very difficult to prove. But I'm sure I'm right, but it'll take some time to prove it. If we go on past the time when the dinosaurs died out, they did die out along with many of the marine creatures. So 50 million years ago is the Eocene period, which was really warm globally, and Tina's worked on much of this. In the same island, Seymour Island, we replaced the dinosaurs with mammals. So there's a marsupial possum. So we have possums, possum-like animals in Antarctica. You see they're crawling about on, again, the southern beach. So these nothofagus plants carried on. They were big trees in the last diagram, and they're kind of still big trees now. Flowering plants are still there. These are carnivorous birds. And then these things are ungulates. I always call them primitive llama-like animals. But here's, the plants stay the same, you see, monkey puzzle trees, conifers, podocarps, flowering plants, and fossil penguins down on the beach. But penguins evolved in warm climates. But no dinosaurs, but the vegetation stayed the same even into these warmer times through Antarctica's history. But then what happened is that cooler climates came into Antarctica, the climate cooled naturally, CO2 levels dropped, and we begin to see the build-up of ice on Antarctica. And glaciers, the rock record, as Tina has showed, if you drill on the margins of Antarctica, you start seeing evidence of ice that has reached the margins of Antarctica through the glacial deposits. So this is a reconstruction of a Miocene ice sheet 23 million years ago, and you can see the ice sheet is building up over what was vegetated land. And then most people thought the vegetation sort of died out then because we lose some of the really big forested fossil trees from the forests in the rock record. But a few years ago now, right up on the Beermore Glacier, so this is quite a long way in the interior of Antarctica, so we're looking here where the Transantarctic Mountains were near the place where Scott and Shackleton went to the South Pole. Geologists were looking for something completely different, and they dislodged some big boulders of rocks, and they found fossil leaves like this here. So you should recognise this now. This is southern beech. This is nothofagus that we've seen all the way through the history of the flowering plants in Antarctica, except we're looking at a different size of tree now. Now, the sediments that they're found in are here. So this is only 300 miles from the South Pole, and this is where these rocks would have been millions of years ago. The age of these rocks are somewhat disputed. They were dated as Pliocene in age, based on things that have been found elsewhere. Some people believe them to be Miocene in age, so they were a few million years younger. In terms of CO2, it's quite interesting. So if they're Pliocene in age, then they were living in an environment with 400 parts per million CO2. If they're Miocene in age, then the estimate for Miocene is 500 parts per million CO2. So basically, I'm just ahead of the game here. Rather than looking at the Pliocene, we're probably looking at a little bit more into the future. But I think they're Pliocene, so we'll take it as that for this talk. So you can see we're really in deep, deep Antarctica, and you can see the sort of nubbly nature of these rocks here. And actually, these rocks here are glacial tillites, glacial diamictites. So these are, you can see they're a real ragbag of rocks. They are really bouldery, chunky. They're really, you can see big boulders, small boulders, muddy bits in here. And what you're looking at here is a whole suite of rocks that have been churned up by glaciers, say in the Pliocene, and they were brought down these valleys. They've mixed up a lot of mud, sand, gravel, rocks, big boulders, and they've just dumped them as a glacial till in front of a glacier in this area. Now, you would never, ever look for fossil plants in a glacial tillite, because you can imagine it's like a bulldozer going through a whole quarry, and anything that was as fragile as a fossil plant would be destroyed. But you can see in here that there are episodes of these. There are chunks of these rocks. So here's one here, and you can see that there is a line of sediment here which looks much finer. It's sort of white in colour. And there's another one on top here, actually, just here. And so all these glacial sediments come in pulses. And basically, each pulse represents a time when there was a glacier here. There was a glacier in this place here, there, dumping rocks down. And in between, these sediments here, they're finely laminated, they're gravels, they're sands, they're fine muds, represent at times, or very short times, probably, as Tina was saying, thousands of years, when the glaciers retreated a little bit and left bare land surface in front of the glacier, which could be colonised by plants. So what we're seeing, if you like, is a very short period of warming between this sort of glacial episode. And if you dig a lot through those sediments, you can see very small twigs. So this shows you the scale of them. You see I'm holding a very small twig here, and you can see that some of this fine layer, which only lasts, it's only about that thick, you can see there's a lot of these small mummified twigs in this layer here. Never been found across Antarctica. There's a couple of other places in this kind of glacial sediment where we've seen them before, but they're very localised and quite remarkable that anybody found them. And here you can see, here's one close up. So this little twig here, for example, you can see that it's actually a branch, not a root, although the whole plant is actually rooted in here. This is a fossil soil on a glacial surface. You can see it's not a very nice place to live. It's got big boulders in it. It's very stony and gravelly. And these poor little trees are growing with their roots and branches, hugging close to the ground, avoiding cold winds. And the roots are sort of growing around these big boulders in the sediment that was dumped on top of them. And if you chop one of these open, they're still quite mummified. We call them mummified. They're not really permineralized at all. They're not turned to stone. They're actually still woody, so they are very young. And if you cut one in half, what you see is hundreds of growth rings. So even though that's about the size of your little finger, that is a very old branch or a very old stem of a tree, which has been growing really, really slowly in a very cold environment. And you can see it's hugging the ground. And because the ground was probably frozen, because the nutrients weren't cycling very well, because there probably wasn't much free water for it, and because the winds would have been very harsh, it would have hugged the ground and grown very slowly. And here you can see, now this is from the Arctic. This is a small tree that's about 1 metre across. This is a different species, but it just shows you in tundra environments in the Arctic, you can see how the trees grow. They hug the ground. These are the small stems, branches, if you like, the trunk, again, hundreds of years old, and they just grow very flat to the ground. Now, I've sectioned hundreds of bits of wood that come out of here, and to identify them, and they're all of the same type. They're all this southern beech. They're all growing very slowly. And southern beech, when it gets to its sort of dwarf limit like this, which it does in southern Patagonia, lives with in a sort of a temperature regime where it can withstand freezing temperatures, even down to about -20, but what it does need is summers of about 5 degrees centigrade every now and then. So it needs to have a summer temperature above freezing so it can reproduce. And so this is quite important because it shows you not only has the glaciers retreated in this area to allow these plants to colonize this diamictite surface, this glacial surface, but at times the summers were warm enough for these little bushes to grow. And the development of a soil profile like that probably does take tens of thousands of years, just like Tina mentioned earlier. And other colleagues have found great big slabs of leaves. So amongst these the woody areas, you can also see slabs of mud, and you can see leaves like this. And of course, these are very similar and familiar to you now. These are the leaves of Nothofagus, southern beech, and they're very similar to these are modern leaves here in this other diagram, a deciduous kind of plant that grows in Tasmania, in the high mountains of Tasmania, in a dwarf-like tundra environment. So this is probably the kind of environment that these small bushes lived in Antarctica. This is a picture I've used from the Arctic just to show you what I think the Pliocene environments in Antarctica would have looked like. So the glacier has retreated a little, and you can see this outwash plain, very gravelly. But in places where it's a bit stable, which is on the edges around here, these little bushes grow and are able to live close to the ground in a tundra kind of environment. So this is probably what the Pliocene of Antarctica was like. So in areas where the ice sheet had retreated a little bit, these little plants were growing. So I call these the last forests in Antarctica. And you also find other plants. So you can see here, this is about that size. It's about 30 centimetres across, and it's a really lightweight, peaty structure. It's a cushion plant, and the cushion plants are very common in the high mountains of Tasmania, sort of growing in this kind of environment where you get ponds and bogs, and then you get these small shrubby trees. This is high mountain Tasmania, very similar kinds of plants. And then you also get other things in there, and I'll show you because they are quite amazing. And this is Alan Ashworth, who is a paleontologist who works on small beetles. So this is these groups of glacial sediments in Antarctica. And here you can see the paleontologist tool of a besom broom cleaning off the sediment. And Alan has this amazing knack of being able to take tiny bits of this sediment. He puts them in water, swirls them around, and find little black things, which he identifies as insects. So he's found all these little black bits here and recognised them as the leg and the body parts and the nose part of a weevil. So we had fossil weevils in Antarctica in the Pliocene, very similar to Magellanic weevils that live in South America today. So these are the remnants of those animals then. And also, quite even more amazingly, there are no flies in Antarctica today, and we spend a lot of time with biosecurity to keep flies away from Antarctica. But Alan found these fossils here, and you see there's a round bit here with two kind of round blobs there, or kind of little round shapes there. Alan, because he's a beetle specialist and a fly specialist, he recognised that as the end of fly larva, fly maggot, basically. You can see those round bits there. So there were flies in Antarctica living amongst our last little tundra forests in the Pliocene in Antarctica. Now recently we've done a bit more work on this. So what we've looked at are biomarkers. So this is quite new techniques. So to try and understand if there's anything else we can pull out about the environment in the Pliocene. And so if you take samples of the sediments and of the woods and of some of the bits of leaves and all of the organic matter, you can put it through geochemical equipment, and you can look at the biomarkers, the fossil biomarkers that occur in the sediments in the wood. So these are the kind of lipids and a kind of the chemistry, if you like, of these plants. And when a student has done all this, what she discovered was that what you could see is you could see the chemical signatures of all the different components of the vegetation. So we've got, she picked out very clearly the angiosperms, the flowering trees, this is the southern beach, they came out as the overwhelming plant's chemical signature in this suite. And we've also got evidence for mosses, sedges, bryophytes and algae, the kind of plants that you get in a kind of boggy, high mountain environment. So we have fossils of those, I haven't shown you them, but we have fossils of those, and she can see the geochemical signature of them in her experiments. So what we've got, I think, in Antarctica at that time, 400 parts per million CO2. The ice sheet doesn't extend all the way to the coast. At times it was going close to the South Pole. We had a mosaic of bogs, herbs, shrubs, tundra plants, just like here in high mountains of Tasmania, and using some of the chemical indicators that are paleothermometers as well from here, she also found that the summer temperatures were probably between 3 and 5 degrees for the growth of these plants. So what we have finally then is, let's go back to that. So for the Pliocene, we have ice sheets on Antarctica for sure, and Tina has shown evidence for that, and the models show evidence for that. But at times, at 400 parts per million, Antarctica was warm enough that quite close to the South Pole, the ice sheets retreated just for short periods of time when plants could colonize coming in from the edges of Antarctica and colonize the interior of Antarctica and enjoy the short periods of summer warmth. And if we carry on raising CO2, maybe we'll go back to the Cretaceous and we'll have luscious green forests in Antarctica when maybe the CO2 levels are perhaps about 1,000 parts per million. But let's hope we can do something before we get to that extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Wonderful. Time for a question or two. People were completely convinced by those weevils, all right? Got to be an expert eye, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, I can spot them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just curious, you mentioned there were no flies at the time, and you're trying very hard to make sure there are no flies in Antarctica today. What's the reason for that?
So at the moment in Antarctica, there are no flies. There are very few endemic creatures in Antarctica or plants in Antarctica today because we're recovering from, the massive ice age now. And what we don't want is any unnatural aliens in Antarctica. So actually, many things like British Antarctic Survey, National Antarctic Programmes work very, very hard to ensure the biosecurity of Antarctica. And what we don't want to do is introduce animals, plants, insects from other parts of the world into Antarctica because they're not part of the natural ecosystem. It may evolve over time, but currently we don't have any major insects in Antarctica. There's a few springtails and a few little mites, but there are no major flies in Antarctica. And it's very, very easy when you take ships to Antarctica, when you take bunches of bananas to Antarctica, to, research station kitchens, when you take ships full of tourists to Antarctica, it will be very, very easy for some insects to slip in and then you'd have a whole unnatural ecosystem that comes in. And Antarctica is currently what we call pristine, and the ecosystem is very delicate, what is there, and what we don't want to do is disturb it by unnatural aliens coming from outside.
I think it's fair to say that if alien species did get into Antarctica, and in particular the peninsula, that they would be all right, wouldn't they? They would be able to survive.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, so years ago, say probably 10, 20 years ago, if you're a tourist on a ship or if you're a scientist, you are made to go through all of your clothing before you go there, hoover it, vacuum it up and check all the Velcro to make sure you don't have seeds in you're inadvertently taken to Antarctica. Now, years and years ago, if you took a seed to Antarctica, probably nothing would have happened because it was so cold in the winter and in the summer that the seed would just die. It wouldn't germinate. But now things are warming up on the peninsula, particularly, and there is concern that small seeds could go there and they could germinate. And even plants that require insects to germinate them, you know, the insects could live there and then they could start germinating, and then we could really have a real problem with introduced vegetation into Antarctica. And we really don't want that.
And one last question over here. Thank you. Thanks, Simon.
So I wonder if you could speak a bit more about how is it to be there in Antarctica as someone who has had a chance to participate in expeditions, and maybe what are some climate proxies that you use to you know, extrapolate all this information about what you're talking.
Okay. Well, the climate proxies that I have used with fossil plants are several. So, for example, we can look at the actual plant itself, and we have use the approach of what's called nearest living relative. So if we know where plants live today, the temperature range, we can extend that to Antarctica. That's a sort of a generalist idea, I think, to start with, because I think some of the plants in the past had extended tolerances. We can look at tree rings in the fossil wood, and that tells us about growth patterns, and it tells us a bit about temperature limits, and tells us a bit about water availability. We can do some quite sophisticated things with angiosperm wood that has very specific wood structures. The fossil leaves, we can look at the shape of the fossil leaves, the margins, whether they have teeth or smooth, and things like that. We don't have cuticle on the fossil leaves, but many paleobotanists work with leaves that still has the leaf material on it, and they still have the stomata, the sort of holes in which the leaves breathe, and then you can actually use that as an index of CO2. Unfortunately, we don't have any cuticle in many of the leaves that we have in Antarctica, which is a bit of a shame. So we can't get that CO2 proxy. So from the plants, there are quite a lot of things, and now we're moving more into the geochemical side of trying to understand what the plants, the chemistry of the plants is telling us about environments in the past. But with that, we also use everything else we can get as a signal of past climates from the sediments as well. So you don't use just one proxy, you use as many different sources of information about climate as environment as you possibly can. And what's it like to live there? It's fantastic. Work there. It's fantastic. It's cold. Sometimes it's miserable. But on the whole, it's wonderful.
I've got a question as well, and it's along the same lines. So you've cut through some of these twigs, and you've noticed there's hundreds and hundreds of rings. Is there such thing as sort of Pliocene Antarctic dendrochronology? Can you? No. Is it even possible that might be a thing?
So what Martin's asking is, can you take, like modern dendrochronologists do, they can take a tree that grows today and take a pattern of rings, and then they can take another tree that's slightly older, and they can match the rings so that you can go back in time. Yeah. So I have tried this. Yeah, I have tried this with several suites of fossil wood that I've work on, but it's really difficult, and haven't managed to do it.
We need AI.
Yeah, we need AI.
More twigs than some AI. We're dying.
We need a load more twigs. The trouble is, I mean, even in a soil profile like that, you are actually looking at probably thousands of years. So the chance of getting a small twig that and getting enough that cover that kind of time frame is quite tricky. But it would be nice.
Okay. We'll take some more later, if I may. We'll move on. Thank you, Jane. Our final speaker is Professor Rob de Conto. Which one is it? Short one or short one?
You'll laugh when you say short.
I won't even
No,
look.
it's going to be okay.
Okay, we're good. From University.
No.
Oh, so it's not that one.
It's okay. So back up.
I'm leaving it.
Well, no.
What do you want me to do?
I can't drive a PC.
Okay. I'll come in out again.
It's like being on the left side of the street.
Oh, yeah. We're good. Sorry. From the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, Professor Rob de Conto.
Thanks. I've had to try to follow Jane before. It's tough. I'm going to start hiding things in my slides. That was a great reaction. So a lot of people have helped develop some of these ideas. So I've stepped back. I actually sort of put this together during the earlier talks in the beginning of the coffee break, thinking about what's been said. And I'm going to try to get from the global, go to Antarctica, and then bring it to the local. And you'll see at least how I'm going to try to do that. So these are colleagues, PhD students, postdocs that I've worked with over the years. So, you know, this is the bottom line. This is close to where I grew up. And there were 2 events like this last year in Boston, and they were 100 or 200-year events, both happening in the same year. So the background sea level there, you know, is increasing the frequency of these events. The storms might be getting more powerful. There might be more tropical cyclones. So we're trying to say more with a little bit more confidence about what the background sea level will do. So I just wanted to provide a little general background and context. So we're going to go back to the Pliocene, but to get a feeling for what sea level's done fairly recently, we've seen about 18 or so centimeters of sea level rise since roughly 1900. But a take-home message for you, this is one of the things I'd love for you to remember, is that the community is pretty confident now that the rate of sea level rise is accelerating. And you don't have to be a statistician to look at the plot on the right. This is our best look using satellite information, looking down on the ocean surface. That black line, you can see that it sort of looks like a little bit of a banana shape. Okay, the rate is accelerating. It's now a little over 3 millimeters per year. It doesn't sound like a lot, but a decade goes by and that adds up. And what Steve Narum did with this paper is he just pointed out, okay, so you could do the math. Even if sea level rise, the rate doesn't change at all relative to what we're observing today. You go out another 80 years to the year 2100, and you're going to add roughly 25 or so centimeters to sea level rise. But he's pointing out that if the acceleration keeps going, you're looking at tens of centimeters of potential sea level rise. So where the sea level rise has been coming from, at least over the previous century, was mainly here. It's the fact that the oceans are absorbing roughly 90% of the extra heat that's caused by the loading of greenhouse gases, and that heating of the ocean is making the waters expand. It's taking up more space, and that was driving roughly, in the last century, about half of the total sea level rise. Okay, now, the other 50%, you know, you could think of as a roughly equal mix between mountain glaciers and the big ice sheets. Okay, but mountain glaciers all over the world only have the potential to drive roughly half a meter of sea level rise. It's really the big ice sheets that Tina and others have been talking about today that have the enormous potential to have, you know, like planet-changing, coastline-changing impacts on the planet. And so we're trying to understand them. And that's where the Pliocene really, I think, shines as having some potential to provide some guidance. Okay, so the big ice sheets. So, you know, Greenland is a really beautiful place and a beautiful ice sheet, but we're mostly going to talk about Antarctica today, largely simply because of the fact that it has roughly 8 times more potential in terms of sea level rise than Greenland. Okay, that's the big player. So now, it might seem a little counterintuitive because when we look at the 2 ice sheets today with satellites, Greenland is actually about twice the contributor to sea level rise that Antarctica is today. So they're both contributing more and more to sea level rise, faster and faster. And in fact, land ice, the loss of land ice, has now taken over from the ocean warming as the dominant driver of sea level rise. But today, it's mostly about Greenland. About 60% of Greenland's contribution to sea level rise is coming from the fact that there's more and more melt. The surface of the ice is getting warmer every year. There's meltwater running off and eventually making its way through the ice sheet, to the bed of the ice sheet, over the surface, and eventually making it into the ocean before it refreezes. Okay, Antarctica has something else going on that makes it really special, and we'll see that in a minute. The first is, I just want to point out that there's, just in the last year or so, there have been multiple studies that are saying, okay, well, there's an indication that Antarctica is really beginning to wake up and that the pace of mass loss of Antarctica is really accelerating. And you can see that in this, this study that was really spearheaded here in the UK by Shepherd et al. The so-called IMBY team uses multiple methods to try to look at the ice sheets and how they're changing. And what they're finding is, and again, you can kind of see this shape. There's an acceleration in the rate of contribution of Antarctica to sea level rise. And if you look at their table, and I know this is really small, but they've broken down the mass loss of Antarctica, the ice that's going into the ocean and cause sea level rise. And you can see these numbers here in gigatons per year, and you see this 219 plus or minus 43. So still a lot of uncertainty in these estimates. This is 2012 to 2017. But if you back up sort of toward the beginning of their analysis, in the early 1990s, mid-1990s, you can see that there's roughly a four-fold increase in the pace that Antarctica is losing mass, and that ice is going into the ocean. Okay, so Antarctica is special not just because of the sheer size of the ice sheet, but largely because the ice sheet is sitting on bedrock, and Tina alluded to this, that's way below sea level, like in some places more than 2 kilometers below sea level. And we can see this in this map. So this is what the ice sheet would look, or the bedrock, the bed, the earth under the ice sheet. If we were able to just look through the ice sheet with X-ray vision, this is what it would look like. And anything that's in the light blues is below sea level. And on the right, this is the edge of the ice sheet itself in white. So this is from an ice sheet model that tries to predict the flow of the ice sheet that's sitting on this bed. And you can see that the edge of ice, in some places that ice is more than several kilometers or a couple of kilometers thick, is sitting on bedrock that is well below sea level. Okay, and Greenland is really a different animal in a way, because you can see that, yes, it has a central basin, largely depressed because of the ice sheet itself pushing down on the crust, but this is the edge of the Greenland ice sheet, and you can see a lot of it is terrestrial, punctuated by relatively narrow outlet glaciers that carve through fjord channels to the open ocean, but there isn't vast stretches of ice that's a kilometer thick in places in direct contact with the ocean like there is around so much of Antarctica. And that turns out to have made trying to model the physics of the flow of the ice that is flowing from the interior of the ice sheet out toward the ocean really difficult. And there have been some advances in the last few years that we'll talk about. Now, Greenland, again, if the Greenland story we think is going to, in the future, continue to be dominated by melt, surface mass balance, the loss of the surface of the ice sheet due to warm summer temperatures in particular. But this is sort of the classic, this is what, and this is a classic study by Alex Robinson and others. So what he did was he took an ice sheet model like the one that we'll be looking at for the rest of the talk on Antarctica, and he said, okay, so I have my ice sheet model. It does a nice job reproducing the modern Greenland ice sheet. And all Alex did was he increased the summer temperatures over the ice sheet by 2 degrees, then he tried 4 degrees, then 6, and then 8. And he looked to see how fast the ice sheet disappeared and went into the ocean. And you can see that these are so-called ensembles, that he did multiple simulations with little tweaks in the model physics. And you're going to see more ensembles. This is what we do with modeling, where we're not really certain about all of the physics in the model. We want to explore the uncertainty of that particular model. So we just change some of the physical parameters to see, get a feeling for the uncertainty that we're working with. It's pretty clear that when Alex went from 2 to 4, there's a really big jump. You've crossed some sort of threshold where the rate of the response to the ice sheet has really increased. 8 degrees, and this is pretty important, I think, even 8 degrees of summer warming, yes, he was able to lose 100% of the ice sheet, but it took 2 millennia. This ice sheet is worth a little more than 7 meters of equivalent sea level rise. So this is giving us a feeling for the potential rates of mass loss of the Greenland ice sheet, largely through these surface mass balance processes. Now, with Antarctica, really different, that really huge ice sheet sitting on bedrock that's way below sea level, could Antarctica actually do something much faster than this in terms of delivering ice to the ocean? Okay, and again, this is sort of why we're going to focus the rest of the talk on Antarctica. Okay, so we can build numerical models, and that's of the ice sheet, and that's what I've been involved in now for almost 2 decades, working largely with David Pollard at Penn State University. We've developed our own ice sheet model, and we can get the model to reproduce a nice-looking modern ice sheet. We have ice shelves that that plug up these ocean embayments that help slow the seaward flow of ice. We have ice streams, so these red colors are regions of fast flow. This is a map of the surface ice speed. We can match this to satellite observations to see if the ice sheet dynamics, the physics in the model are doing a good job, and that's great. We are able to reproduce a modern-looking ice sheet given modern climate. But that really doesn't mean that this model is going to tell me something meaningful about the future. And of course, that's where the important paleo observations come in. Now, you'd think, okay, so we have a growing satellite record of observations of what the ice sheet's doing. I showed you an example of satellite observations of the ice sheet with mass loss and mass change. But, you know, they go back to, in this case, for the GRACE instrument, this is a satellite that measures gravity over the ice sheet to measure mass loss. The record goes back to 2002. Other records, like the IMBI study we just looked at, push a little further back in time, but we're still just talking about a couple of decades in terms of our real, you know, detailed analysis of what these big ice sheets are doing. A couple of decades for an ice sheet is, it's literally like me looking at this record, this snapshot of what's going on over a couple of decades. It'd be like me feeling the weather in London today, and right, it's really, really cold, and me saying, oh, I know what London weather is in the month of April based on today, right? That would be crazy. Nobody would do that. Okay, so we need the longer term perspective, big time. The modern observations are important. They help. And you can, this isn't, okay, you're thinking, okay, was Rob drinking last night when he made this slide? No, I actually inverted it. I flipped it upside down to show how we might use a satellite estimate of mass loss over East Antarctica, West Antarctica, and then the total to compare to a model simulation of mass change over East Antarctica, West Antarctica in red, and the total in black. Many, sometimes hundreds of simulations with slightly tweaked physics in every version of this ice sheet model to see if we can get the model to match the observations. And we're doing that, and this is great. But again, that little snapshot of the observational record over the last few decades just isn't good enough. Okay, so we turn to geologists and work of people like Tina and others. So this is my colleague Andrea Dutton, and what Andrea does, she gets to tromp all over the tropics looking for ancient reefs. And you can see Andrea standing on a reef in the Seychelles. She's standing on a reef that's 8 meters above present-day sea level. And we have really good dating techniques. She can tell me exactly how old that reef is. That reef was living 125,000 years ago, the last interglacial. So not the Holocene that we're living in today, the previous interglacial. So on the other side of the last ice age. To a geologist, this is yesterday, and sea level was 8 meters in the Seychelles. Here's another example of a reef in the Florida Keys, 8 meters above present day during the last interglacial. So these are the kinds of records, right? Let's go back to the Pliocene. These, I'm sure you can all recognize this. These are oysters, and they've got barnacles growing on them. You don't have to be the world's greatest field geologist to say, this looks like an old beach. And you can take a GPS, and you can go out into the field, and you know exactly how high in elevation you are. You can map it in your field notes and say, here's an ancient beach. And it turns out this one was dated at 3 million years ago, the Pliocene we're talking about. This one's 22 meters above present-day sea level. Okay? So Maureen Ramo championed a proposal that the National Science Foundation in the U.S. funded to try to get at the maximum level, height, that sea level was in the Pliocene. And Maureen, we were all optimistic. We were going to go all over the world, collect all these data, put them on a map, and try to reconstruct what Pliocene sea level was. Well, it's really complicated, and it's really complicated because it turns out that when the ice sheets grow and shrink, they actually change the geoid, the gravitational field of the planet, which actually changes the sea surface height. So you actually have to know if the sea level rise came from Greenland or if it came from Antarctica to say something about the meaningfulness of your nice barnacle-covered boulder. Okay, other things happen on Pliocene timescales. Going back 3 million years, it turns out that plate tectonics are moving, potentially moving that ancient beach that you're looking at and recording its elevation. It turns out that the mantle moves and flows in a, right? It's still geophysical fluid dynamics, and that makes the land surface go up and down as well. And this so-called dynamic topography caused by mantle motion that can make the land surface go up and down works on these kinds of timescales where you can get tens of meters or more of vertical change on the Earth's surface when you go in some locations just back 3 million years. Now, if dynamic topography could change the location of your ancient beach, you've got a really good number. It's 22 meters above sea level. But maybe that location has actually been uplifting, then you can see that you're going to introduce an important bias in your data set. Conversely, if that ancient beach deposit dropped more than sea level rose during the Pliocene, then that beach wouldn't exist and you would never be able to record it. Again, introducing biases. So we've had a really hard time improving the constraints on the Pliocene sea level numbers. This is one of the great frustrations, I think, for the community that goes out and does this field work because of all these complications. There are ways to use geochemistry in the ocean to try to do a better job, and you'll see one quick example of that. This is why the direct records, this is still important information. Tina threw some numbers out there. I think she said, what, 0 to 40 meters. And maybe you could say, okay, what's the central estimate? Well, maybe it's 20 plus or minus 10. You could say something like that. And that's sort of where the community is leaning. It's a lot of sea level rise. It's probably a lot more during the Pliocene than during the last interglacial I showed you, which was already scary at 6 to 9 meters. But we still have pretty loose constraints on the sea level numbers. So we look to people like Tina, who are drilling holes around the ice sheets to really try to say, wow, it looks like this part of the ice sheet was responding big time to changes in the orbit during the Pliocene. And that provides us another really important constraint for the modeling. Okay, so sea level rose in the last century, about 18 centimeters. It's rising 3 millimeters a year today. It's accelerating. These are your take-home, right, when I email you all and quiz you on the talk. This is the other important point I want you to understand. This goes back to trying to reconstruct ancient sea level. This also is important for the future. Sea level in the future is not going to change by 3 millimeters or more per year everywhere. Not everyone feels the same sea level rise, largely because of this gravitational effect. When we lose ice from Greenland, it changes the Earth's gravitational field because the ice is leaving Greenland and then being distributed out over the whole ocean. And so this is pretty wild. On the short time scale, as Greenland is losing ice, the sea level in these blues are sea level is actually going down. Okay, even though the global average, the global mean sea level is going up, sea levels around Greenland are going down because Greenland is not pulling gravitationally on the Arctic Ocean as hard anymore. Now, this is really relevant. So this scale over here on the right is just there. It's unitless. This is the relative amount of sea level rise for a given global mean sea level rise coming from, in the map on the left, Greenland. So if you look at the 1 line, where we go from red to orange, 1 means you get 100% of what you expect. You lose 1 meter of ice worth of global mean sea level from Greenland. Wherever you see a 1 contour, you get that 1 meter of sea level rise. If you are in these color blues down here where 0 is, you get 0 sea level rise. And then anything in the dark blue, you get sea level drop, even though Greenland just put a meter of sea level into the ocean. If you follow the 0 line, it goes right through the UK, basically. So Greenland can contribute a lot to future sea level. So this is a case for you in the UK to all, right? This is why the British Antarctic Survey, I suppose, is here. Is there a Greenland survey? No. Right, exactly. So you see the point. So we're in dark reds up here. when it comes to a contribution to sea level from Antarctica. Okay, again, another, at least this is totally northern hemispheric centric view, but one of the reasons why a lot of us are really interested in getting the Antarctic story straight. Okay, this is an interesting, again, it is a sort of confounding, again, problem in trying to say something about ancient sea level. So on the left is a pretty healthy looking modern-like Greenland ice sheet, roughly worth 7 meters of equivalent sea level. Here is an example of an ice sheet simulation that after years of trying, and you'll see we're going to come to this in a minute, this is the Antarctic ice sheet. It looks funny. It looks funny because the West Antarctic ice sheet is gone, and we have big retreat into these East Antarctic embayments that Tina has been, saying, I have geologic evidence that this happened. Okay, now, remember, on a Pliocene timescale, the Earth's orbit is changing. And there's a component of the Earth's orbit related to the Earth's eccentricity, how eccentric or elliptical our orbit is around the sun, combined with something else called precession, that is the timing of the Earth's orbit when it's closest to the sun, either being in January or July. That changes on a roughly 20,000 year time scale. So there are orbital changes within a time window when we can look for these sort of plus or minus 1 million years of sea level change, where Greenland might be having a nice cold summer for a few thousand years while Antarctica is getting blasted by some extra heating in the summer. And then 10,000 years later, the opposite happens, where Greenland is feeling very strong summer warm orbits and Antarctica is not. So if we have a target to produce 20 meters of sea level rise out of the Antarctic, or combined, right? Really, these Pliocene sea level estimates are the combined, both Greenland and Antarctica. If Greenland was fully healthy, it could essentially hide 20 meters of sea level rise in Antarctica if they both weren't retreated at the same time. So this is the kind of thing, again, it's an interesting complication to the story that, again, is really making it challenging in saying Greenland contributed this much in the Pliocene, Antarctica contributed that much. Again, these are the information that we'd really love to have, which is why we're trying to work so much so with people like Tina, where we're able to actually look at individual sectors around the ice sheets. And we're doing the same thing with groups studying Greenland, and you can see why, hopefully. Okay, we can use the ocean records too. These are geochemical records that come out of the ocean. They're complicated because, for example, the isotopic composition of the oceans that people reconstruct by dissolving calcium carbonate in acid and then analyzing the isotopic composition of the oxygen in organisms that lived in the oceans in the past, we can use the difference in these values between the Pliocene, for example, in the present day, and look at a change in the isotopic composition of the ocean. The problem is that there are two things that are affecting this record. One is temperature and one is ice volume. So unless you know the temperature component of this, we really can't really nail down how much of this change is due to changes in ice volume. Some modeling might help. And there are all kinds of uncertainties about what you should even use for a range between the present day and the Pliocene, for example. There's these records they're temporally pretty coarse. They might have a few thousand years of resolution. You might never even capture a maximum Pliocene interglacial when Antarctica was its smallest. So there's still a lot of uncertainty and a lot of work for the geologists to do. Okay, but this is what they come up with, and this is the compilation I think Tina might have showed that Andrea Dutton put together a few years ago. And this is sort of these are the sorts of numbers. The last interglacial, these are the reefs that she was standing on. We're thinking about 6 to 9 meters, and the Pliocene, 6 meters at least, and possibly much, much more. And again, right, this is one of the things that keeps us up at night, because if the world really just did have 400 parts per million CO2, this implies really pretty extreme sensitivity of the ice sheets to a little bit of relatively small amount of warming, a few degrees. Okay, so last 10 years, we worked on developing these ice sheet models that take into account the dynamics of the ice and the ice flow, that account for the fact that a lot of the Antarctic ice sheet is sitting on bedrock that's below sea level. And and Tina mentioned this, okay, not only is the bed of the actual grounded ice sheet in many places below sea level, but the bedrock actually slopes away from the ocean down into the interior of the continent. And it turns out that the amount of ice that can flow from the ice sheet itself that's grounded on its bed out toward the ocean, sometimes to form these long floating ice tongues or ice shelves, it turns out that the rate of actually the flux, the amount of ice that can flow out toward the ocean, is a very, very strong function of the thickness of the ice at the point where the ice sheet is beginning to float. We call this the grounding line. So the ice is flowing from left to right, and just at the point where it's beginning to float to lift off its bed, that's the grounding line. The flux of ice through the grounding line relates to its thickness, the thickness of the ice there, to something like the 5th power of the thickness of the grounding line. So if we start to have a change, let's say some warming under an ice shelf, and the ice shelf goes away, the ice shelves provide resistive stress to the flow of the ice from the ice sheet out into the ocean. So if something bad were to happen to these ice shelves that are sitting in the ocean, they're in contact with ocean water, if they start to thin or maybe break up altogether, we have less resistive stress, this so-called buttressing term. The ice flux will start to increase. That means that the ice sheet will start to thin out here. And if it starts to thin out here, it's not grounded anymore. Where it used to be, it'll start to float, and the grounding line will retreat back. And because now we're retreating back onto a reverse slope bed, the grounding line thickness increases, and you get a lot more ice flux out into the ocean. It's a positive feedback that would be ongoing, maybe until something changes in the slope of the bed below the ice, or maybe the ice sheet could somehow reform a nice ice shelf that could then start to provide a lot of buttressing to start to hold back the flow of ice again, to stop this positive feedback process. This is called the marine ice sheet instability, and we, among others, this was a big challenge for us about now going back about 15 years to try to get these physics to work in an ice sheet model. And when we did, we were excited because for the first time with a last interglacial climate or a Pliocene climate, we were able to simulate the collapse, the demise of the West Antarctic ice sheet, which was great. Now, there's a problem with this. We were patting ourselves on the back at the time, and this is, around, about 2009 or so. This is the problem. So our Pliocene ice sheet, only 1.5 meters of sea level. So it looks like a much bigger change because the whole West Antarctic ice sheet has collapsed because of these marine ice sheet instability physics we got working in the model. But even though we got about a 4-meter contribution to sea level out of West Antarctica, the Pliocene is warmer than the modern climate, which means we were getting more precip and snow was accumulating in the interior. So even though we lost the West Antarctic ice sheet, the East Antarctic ice sheet thickened and compensated. Not even close to what the geologists are saying we might need for a target in the Pliocene. We also weren't getting very extensive retreat in these East Antarctic basins that now Tina is showing some strong geological evidence for. So there must have been something wrong. And I want to emphasize this part of the story because this is an example of the geologists and their improving and growing records pushing the modeling. We went back to the drawing board and said there's got to be something obvious missing. Okay, these are two iconic images. These are satellite images of an ice shelf out here on the Antarctic Peninsula, not too far away from where Jane collects all those beautiful fossils. This ice shelf is roughly the size of a New England state, okay? So I know you can appreciate that. Okay, this dark stuff on the surface is water. And that water is on, it's a thick, maybe 600-meter thick slab of ice shelf. And that ice shelf is really important because it's slowing, it's providing buttressing, resistive stress to the flow of the ice draining out of these outlet glaciers. You can see a nice big one right here. This is the Crane Glacier. The Crane Glacier is bumping into this ice shelf that's providing resistance. Okay, but we're starting to get meltwater, and it's making ponds. And that ice shelf is feeling changes in the tides. That meltwater is moving around. Now we're getting a lot of meltwater, and those shifting flexural stresses in the ice shelf are starting to drive more deeper and deeper crevasses, and eventually the weight of the water itself in the crevasses now on this flexing ice shelf are starting to penetrate deeper and deeper, and within a very short period of time, a couple of weeks, the entire thing broke up. And what's really amazing is that when it broke up, the Crane Glacier back here that we were just looking at just lost its buttressing ice shelf, and it sped up Crane by about a factor of 4. Okay? Now, so the marine ice, that's sort of the marine ice sheet instability, you know, an observation of that happening. This is beginning to speed up, and it's going to start reverse backing into this fjord trough. So it's backing up, but really fast into that fjord trough after it lost its buttressing ice shelf. What's kind of remarkable about this, when it loses its buttressing, the flow of the ice increases, but the actual front of the glacier is actually still backing up into the fjord. And this is akin to where we're going. You can kind of see this feature because of the light angle. There's a vertical cliff right here. Okay, so glaciers, when they hit the ocean, they tend to form cliffs. And this happens at all scales, from, you know, these sort of iconic tidewater glaciers in Alaska. You can take a nice, expensive cruise and watch calving events coming off of the face of this. It's the edge of even ice shelves, right, where these spectacular tabular icebergs break off and eventually go out into the ocean. That's a really nice vertical ice cliff. They occur at a much bigger scale than something like this, too. So these are two of the biggest examples we have on the planet today. These are two outlet glaciers in Greenland. So these are two narrow, really deep, roughly kilometer-deep fjords feeding the interior of the ice sheet up here. You can see it in the background. Is coming down this fjord, and it's hitting the ocean. This is the Helheim Glacier in East Greenland. It has lost its buttressing ice shelf. And it is so thick. So the edge of this glacier is just resting on its bed. It's very close to the point of being at flotation, but the water depth is roughly 1,000 meters here. So whatever you see floating above the surface, roughly 10% of that, this is a 100-meter tall ice cliff, but you can't, you know, you're not seeing 800 meters or so of what's below the sea surface. This is the Jakobshavn Glacier on Greenland, which also has lost in relatively recent times its buttressing ice shelf. It has even a little bit taller ice cliff than Helheim. Now, what's remarkable is that Jakobshavn is flowing down into the ocean at a rate of about 12 kilometers per year on average. And yet this calving face is backing into the ice sheet. So the pace of the mechanical failure of the ice is actually outpacing the downstream flow of the ice, even though this is the fastest flowing glacier in the world. Brittle processes are really important in places that have thick ice reaching the ocean to form these tall ice cliffs. And the reason ultimately is quite simple. It's just gravity. This is the kind of thing that happens in these settings. So hopefully really nice imagery caught by the Swansea group here in the UK. So this is the narrow fjord. It's about 5 kilometers across. There's our 100-meter tall ice cliff. But this thing's almost a kilometer thick. But you would have to be there to ever be able to imagine the scale of an event like that. Okay. So 2 things. Hydrofracturing, when ice shelves get a lot of water on them, they can break up. We've seen that. It's in the observational record. And when they do, places where we have thick ice reaching the ocean, that have now lost their ice shelf that used to be out here now are prone to structural failure of the ice front. Okay, and the physics are relatively simple. The weight of the ice itself is producing a net stress that's seaward that isn't fully compensated by the hydrostatic pressure, the weight of the water against that's trying to hold that calving front up. And if you just do it, if you vertically integrate this through the thickness of first something with the density of glacial ice and then something with a smaller thickness but the density of water, you realize that there's a net longitudinal stress that is from the cliff toward the ocean. And that will do two things. It will get the ice behind the cliff to stretch and deform. It'll cause a deformation on the ice. The deviatoric stress, this is the net, there's a net deviatoric stress from left to right because the water column isn't compensating fully for the weight of the ice itself. Now, we know something about the strength of ice, and you can do these calculations. They're quite straightforward and figure out at what point, at what height does this cliff have to be where you start to just simply overcome the material strength of ice itself. Now, if there are big crevasses in the ice behind the calving front, then you have a relatively thin column of ice that's trying to support all of that stress. And so the longitudinal stress actually goes up as the crevassing gets deeper and deeper and deeper. And so what we did was we simply took these two things. We took the ice shelf breakup caused by hydrofracturing. When you start to get a lot of meltwater on the surface of ice shelves, you lose the ice shelves, you end up with a now unsupported ice front. And if that ice front is thick enough, we calculate the stresses in places where the strength of the ice is exceeded. You say, okay, calving, like we see in Greenland, is beginning to happen. Now, it turns out this is really important because if those sorts of processes we saw in Greenland start happening in Antarctica, there are many places in Antarctica where this isn't happening today. The ice is thick enough to drive this structural failure, but that ice is protected by a buttressing ice shelf. And so we don't see Jakobshavn and Helheim style of calving widespread in Antarctica. So what we realized, there might not only be a marine ice sheet instability driven by the ductile flow processes of ice, but a fracture-driven structural instability of the ice itself, where if we fully lose an ice shelf, then you could end up with exposed ice in direct contact with the ocean that would be thick enough, especially if it's heavily crevassed, where there would be structural failure of the ice. So regardless of the details of the style of calving, and there are lots of people looking at the details of the actual calving by calving event, exactly what's going on, once you exceed that material strength of the ice, it's going to have to break one way or another. Okay, so hydrofracturing and cliff collapse. We put these two new physics into our ice sheet model, and we get 11 meters of sea level rise out of the ice sheet in the Pliocene. And not only that, we are able to demonstrate even the orbital variability, it's not shown here, that Tina talked about, of these East Antarctic basins deglaciating. We were never able to do that before. This is the Wilkes Basin, the Aurora Basin, right? This is one of the papers that Tina worked on. So this is looking good. As well as we're, and this is work of Ed Gasson, who's sitting in the back of the room right now, while he was a postdoc with me in Massachusetts. And Ed actually took this another step further. He actually looked at the isotopic composition of the snowfall landing on the ice sheet and tracked that snowfall through the ice sheet and figured out if the ice sheet were to look like we were beginning to model in the Pliocene, what it would do to the ocean geochemical records to make sure that everything was in line, and it was. So this was starting to give us some confidence that we're being able to do something meaningful for the Pliocene. The same for the last interglacial with these new physics. Instead of just maybe getting 1 meter of sea level out of the ice sheet during the last interglacial, we get something that's much more in line with those beautiful corals that Andrea was standing on in those photos. And not only that, in Greenland today, with these same physics, we're doing a better job of simulating the calving fronts of these outlet glaciers like Helheim and Jakobshavn. So we look at the paleo, that's great, improved model data comparison. We're looking at the modern performance of the model relative to even individual outlet glaciers in Greenland. And then we say, okay, maybe now we're ready to start to apply these models to the future. So we did this in 2016, and this changed my life, maybe not always for the better, turns out, because I think in some respects we could have done a better job with some of this, but here's the take home. When we applied these physics that we were calibrated based on the Pliocene in the last interglacial, what we were finding was that in the RCPs that you've heard about, these sort of standardized emissions trajectories in the future, the warming that you would get in the RCP 8.5, we were seeing something like this in our ensembles. We were getting like a meter of sea level rise just from Antarctica and just by the year 2100. Okay? Tens of meters on a like multi-century time scale. So this is really, really scary stuff. The good news back in the 2016 paper that I kept trying to point out was that, okay, there's an obvious role for policy here, right? Because this is the RCP 2.6, more in line with the spirit of the Paris Climate Agreement, for example. Okay. I'm just going to jump ahead here. Now, the Pliocene sea levels you've heard are really uncertain. The Pliocene sea levels are really uncertain. Here's one range of possible Pliocene sea levels. Maybe the Antarctic contribution to Pliocene sea level was, let's say, 10 to 20 meters. This is within the range that's plausible based on the published literature. If we tune our model physics so we are able to reproduce somewhere between 10 and 20 meters of Pliocene sea level, and then I ran 64 versions of the ice sheet model, and I threw out the versions of the ice sheet model that didn't fall within this range for the Pliocene. Oh, these are backwards. Okay, I got 1 meter. I got a meter of sea level rise. But if I did the same sort of exercise, and I knew that the Pliocene contribution to sea level from Antarctica was only 5 to 15 instead of 10 to 20, I only got 64 centimeters in the year 2100. That's a really different number, especially if you're a coastal planner trying to say something meaningful about what might happen in the future. Now, where I think we went wrong was, it turns out, I think that the climate forcing, so the ice sheet model needs temperature and precipitation and ocean temperature to evolve through time. The atmospheric climates that we were providing for the ice sheet model were simulating too much of that surface meltwater on the surface of the ice shelves too early in the simulations. So we were getting massive breakup of the ice shelves a little bit too early in the model. And this was pointed out recently in a really nice statistical reanalysis of our 2016 model ensembles. So we've done a lot better job in recent years trying to improve the atmospheric climatologies going into this. We've also really expanded the number of simulations that we run, in maybe 64 and now several hundred, to try to compare to the records. What we are still finding in the 2.5 years since we published that paper in 2016, our best model physics now is the same deal. Without these new physics that capture the brittle fracture processes of ice, not just the ductile flow, we're still not able to reproduce the Pliocene, okay? Despite what has fallen out of this, for example, this one statistical reanalysis of our study that concluded that you can still capture the lower end of the Pliocene sea level estimates without these processes, but we can't get the physical models to do this. So better surface climatologies, we've really tried to do a better job. We have all new surface climatologies that we drive these ice sheet models with. And this is what we get. Oh, this is, I know Martin's going to pull me in a second, but I want you to see where this leads. So this is, I want to give you a glimpse of some work that's actually in review right now, and a second paper that was submitted about 4 hours before I drove to the airport to fly here. So new stuff. Okay, so this is what we're doing these days. We run hundreds of perturbed physics ensembles with these ice sheet models, and we compare the ice sheet performance over the satellite era, East Antarctica, West Antarctica, the total, and that lets us throw out some of the bad models that don't capture the observational period. Then we apply, as a second step, for example, to the paleo. And this is an example of running ice sheet models. I know it looks like a really nice head of a bird, the blue. I don't know if you noticed that. And that's my dinosaur. I should have said, does anyone see the bird hidden in the... Okay, so these are the paleo records for the last interglacial. I'm not showing a Pliocene example here. This is the range. The range, even for the last interglacial, is really uncertain what Antarctica's contribution were. These are the sorts of numbers that Andrea Dutton gives me. And it turns out we've been doing such a good job tuning the model that the paleo estimates are not throwing out many of the models at the top end or many of the versions of the ice sheet model at the low end. So they're not giving me enough constraint, particularly at the low end. The last interglacial is actually hardly helping me at all in terms of throwing out bad versions of the model. This is an example. This is sea level predicted now by our model as it stands today in the year 2100. So this is global mean sea level rise just from Antarctica. And this is a histogram of all of our ensemble members that now have been calibrated to the modern observations in the last interglacial. And you can see this is not a nice normal distribution. I've got this really ugly thing here at the low end. Now, if the paleo community were able to reduce the uncertainty in the sea level estimates in the paleo records by just a little bit, this is what happens to the year 2100 sea level estimates. It becomes much more normal, Gaussian distribution, where the mode and the central estimate become much closer, much more in line. So this is sort of like my challenge to the paleo community. This is what we can do with these paleo records. Okay, so these are like 5 slides that I'm just going to go like this, but you'll get the point. So where this has all led since 2016, just to give you a glimpse of the new work. So now we do things like this. We run these models forward in time. We follow a standard emissions scenario. And then when the global mean temperature reaches a Paris Climate Agreement target, I freeze the climate forcing. We don't let the world go beyond plus 1.5. And this is what you get. This is the ensemble calibrated to the paleo and the modern. The central estimate is in the black. These are, you're going to see fan charts that give you a sense of the uncertainty about the central estimate. You can see the percentages here. This is good news. Plus 1.5 degrees, we're getting maybe about 7 centimeters or so out of the ice sheet by the year 2100. This is a big revision from where we were a few years ago. Now let's go to 2 degrees. Okay, we're not going to drown too many people here. This is good. Maybe another centimeter by the year 2100. Okay, now pay attention. We're going to go to 3 degrees. Okay, so it's the same y-axis. There's been a jump in the central estimate, but this, right, there's been a big jump in the upper tail of the distribution. Okay, so we've entered a new realm of uncertainty, certainly. And what's happening is that in a few of the ensemble members, the West Antarctic ice sheet is retreating, and it's retreating very fast. So a huge amount of uncertainty still. You can see why I want more paleo records, because of course we want to know, is that a real threshold? Now let's go to RCP 8.5. Okay, on the same y-axis, very, very different. Where you can see at this last color is the 90 percentile. You're starting to push above 0.5 meter by 2100. Now this is a much rosier picture than we were painting in 2016, but the bad news is that if you have a longer term perspective, like a geologist would, you look beyond the year 2100, by the time you get into the 2120s, 2150s, middle of the next century, we're talking about contributed rates to sea level rise. You will be measuring in centimeters per year, not the 3 millimeters per year that I was talking about at the very beginning of the talk. And there is a possibility that these rates are faster than other people's modeling, because it's not just the ductile deformational flow of ice delivering the ice to the ocean. We're including these brittle processes. There is a concern we're limiting the rate of the breaking of the ice to what's observed in Greenland today. because those are the only observations we have, so they're the only observational constraints we have. But the glaciers in Antarctica, like the famous Thwaites Glacier, instead of 10 kilometers wide like Jakobshavn, is 120 kilometers wide, and it reaches back, this is bedrock below sea level, into beyond this cross-section, which is based on radar imagery that Martin knows very well. This is from Icebridge. This goes way back into a basin that is more than 2 kilometers deep. It's the Bentley Trough. It is the deepest bedrock on the planet that is not covered by ocean. And so we're worried that if the Thwaites Glacier were to begin to retreat on this very deep bedrock on a reverse slope bed, it could end up having ice cliffs exposed without a buttressing ice shelf much, much bigger than anything we see on Greenland today, where the stresses would be enormous. And we don't know the rate that the ice would be breaking if it ever got to this point. So it may be that we're actually being conservative when we talk about rates of sea level rise like this, because we're basing this on what's observed today in Greenland. And Antarctica is vastly bigger, thicker ice, higher stresses, open ocean, not narrow fjords. That ice will get out to the ocean much easier. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Rob. Thank you. Thank you very much. And what we're going to do is we're going to take some questions with others on the panel. So if Alan and Dan and Jane and Tina, if you can join us on here, and with Rob as well. And what we'll take questions for Rob, but also for everybody else. We'll leave that up, because there might be some reason to do that. So who wants to ask the first question? Please, just there. Simon is just at the back here. Hang on a second. No, hang on. Hold on. It's all right. Yeah, you got it.
Thank you. I would like to know just what do you think about the influence of the melt of the Greenland on the warm current that you have in Atlantic Ocean?
Could you repeat that? I didn't
Yeah, we have the warm current that we have in the Atlantic Ocean, and what is the effect of all the fresh water coming from the Greenland on this?
So what is the fresh water from the ice sheet due to the ocean? Is that what you're... Great question. So there are a number limited by...
Rob, can you speak into the microphone, please?
Oh, yeah, no worries. Is this on? Yeah. So, okay, constrained by a talk that was already too long, I couldn't give you some of the good news. And the good news is that there are potentially negative feedbacks that aren't accounted for in all of the work that has been done to date. So what we're finding with meltwater going into the Southern Ocean, and there have been a few studies just published this year, what you end up getting is you stratify the Southern Ocean, we get more sea ice in the climate models, and that limits the vertical mixing in the ocean, which warms the layers below. Now, having warmer water at the edge of the ice sheet is bad because that's going to keep eating the ice shelves away from below. But that expansive sea ice actually cools the atmosphere. So there are really two interesting competing feedbacks. One is positive from a warming subsurface, and but the other is a cooling atmosphere, which could slow down the melt. We don't know which one's going to win. So that's absolutely like the focus of ongoing work right now.
In a way, it could stop the increase of temperature in the north part of the world. Could be a new...
Yeah. So we can even look, there's a far field. Yep, there's an effect on the overturning circulation on the Arctic, even Arctic sea ice fields. These would be massive amounts of meltwater and glacial debris going into the Southern Ocean that people are just now beginning to think about trying to model to see what the impacts would be.
Can I just follow up on that?
Please, Dan.
So that is an important negative feedback, but from a paleoclimate perspective, it's actually relatively short-lived because that freshwater input will stop at some point, and then you'll only be left with the positive feedback. So looking on a multi-centennial to millennial timescale, then those feedbacks will cease to be important.
Thank you. At the far back, I'll come to you in a second. You've asked two questions already, but I will come to you.
Yes, it's sort of connected to that. It's the other side of the equation where the sea ice in the Antarctic, if we lose that, I understand there's a potential for the deep water that's highly carbonate coming up because of the stratification changes, and that you're getting an increase in CO2 output in the Drake's Passage. Is that a true story by the loss of the ice?
Who wants to tell you that?
That's interesting.
Can you repeat the question again? I don't think I quite got it.
The deep water that is running right down the Atlantic and around the oceans stores carbon. One way of that being released is the sea ice removal in the Antarctic, which is a bit of a lid on. This is what I understand, and the question is that true? And will you increase the CO2 output from the deep water in the southern oceans by removing the ice?
So the so the circumpolar deep water around Antarctica is getting shallower and it's getting warmer as well. And that's a real problem because it becomes less productive in that instance. And if it's less productive, it will draw down less carbon dioxide. So I think that's the major problem is the ability of the Southern Ocean to draw down carbon dioxide will be diminished once that warm water gets to the surface.
So the glacial interglacial timescale CO2 record that Martin showed from the ice cores, so that mechanism that you just described has been proposed as one of the important drivers in that 180 to 280 ppm glacial interglacial cycle, where sea ice change in stratification allows respired carbon to come up. But I'm not an expert, and I don't know relative to the sorts of relative to like the RCP emissions in terms of like rates in gigatons per year. I'm not sure how powerful a feedback that would be.
It has been proposed as a really important mechanism for, so going before the Pliocene into the Miocene, there's a relatively warm period, and it has been suggested that the mechanism you talk about could be important for that and could add another 100 or 150 ppm in terms of additional CO2 in the atmosphere. But those studies are quite speculative. Yeah. And so there's certainly potential there, but in IPCC speak, I think it's highly uncertain with low confidence.
Another question. We've got one right at the back. Just behind you, son.
Apologies if this is an extraordinarily ignorant question, but Jane, you briefly mentioned about having to prevent seeds from getting to Antarctica because that would create an unnatural environment or an unnatural ecosystem. So I was just wondering why that's a bad thing, whether you can justify there being an inherent value to a natural ecosystem as opposed to an unnatural one, or whether there's actually some practical value to natural ecosystems.
That's quite a good debate that's going on at the moment about the value of different ecosystems. But I mean, I think most people feel that we have an unusual ecosystem in Antarctica. What perhaps I needed to clarify in my talk was that after the Pliocene, where the forests were, then Antarctica became very, very cold, like Tina was saying, and then all vegetation was wiped out, and most of the historic life and both fauna and flora was wiped out. And so what we've got now is a new type. I mean, if you want Antarctica to be covered in any kind of forests, I mean, if you want to do say what we're doing in the Northern Hemisphere, I'll tell you a story. I recently went to South Georgia. Right? South Georgia is an island sitting in the sub-Antarctic. It's next to the Falklands, and it's a sliver of rock that's like a chunk of the Alps that's been plonked, and it's so far from anywhere. It's 4 days of being seasick on a ship to get there. So, but it is really isolated, and it has a very unique flora and fauna. Unfortunately, it was contaminated during days of the whaling by reindeer being taken down by food and by rats from ships. And the South Georgia government and many conservation people are trying to turn it back to its endemic vegetation because it supports things like very unusual colonies of albatross and penguins, and mixing it up doesn't work at all in that case. But the conservation leader in Kew was with us, and I did have a conversation about him because here he was trying to conserve the endemic flora of South Georgia. Whereas, look what happens here in the UK. We send out all our botanists from Kew Gardens around the rest of the world to find unusual plants for your garden, and they bring back and they make the vegetation uniform. So, it is a philosophical question. You can either collect native plants from everywhere and bring it back so that we mix and match everywhere in the world, or you can try and understand an ecosystem which is pure, if you like, and endemic to a certain area. And that's only going to happen in areas like isolated islands or Antarctica, where it's very difficult for that kind of mixing to go on.
Do you want to explain a little bit about how the treaty works with the Committee on Environmental Protection?
Yes. So Antarctica is a very, very special place because it's not owned by anyone, although there were some ancient land claims, but it's not owned by anyone, and it's governed by the Antarctic Treaty. So 53 nations that work in Antarctica meet every year, and they agree to look after Antarctica by consensus. And it's part of their national laws as well. But there are two parts of the treaty. There are all the legal issues, but there's also a committee for environmental protection, and all the countries in Antarctica work very, very hard to protect the Antarctic environment, to keep it unique, to keep it clean, to keep it the ecosystem pure. And so there is a huge amount of work that goes on with biosecurity, with ensuring that sort of any different kind of plants and animals are brought into Antarctica to interfere with the natural state. And to be honest, if we really want to see how things are going to evolve over time, the pure evolution with climate change, we can't do that unless we absolutely know what is native to that particular area and how it's going to change.
It was a good question, wasn't it?
I always say to people, will Antarctica be really so attractive when it looks like Switzerland? Which it could do in the future, and we've imported a lot of vegetation.
Please, yes, Dan. Do we know why? Hang on a second. Let's get the microphone.
Hi. Do we know why, from 100 million years ago, when Antarctica had a lot of green vegetation, it suddenly became an ice sheet? What were the main driving forces for this event?
So it's a very famous paper written by Rob at the end of the table. It's about the natural drawdown of carbon dioxide. So that if you read old papers, you'll see ideas about plate tectonic movements, about the isolation of Antarctica in a current, which are all part of the story. But I think now the consensus is that it was a natural drawdown of carbon dioxide. Do you want to pick that up?
That's perfect. I like the famous part.
Yeah, he wrote the paper. But no, about natural drawdown, the natural process. So higher levels of CO2 naturally would have come from volcanoes, and particularly in the Cretaceous, 100 million years ago, there was a lot of tectonic activity. Plates are moving around, lots of carbon dioxide put into the atmosphere. And then over millions of years, the natural geological cycle is to draw down that carbon dioxide from weathering of rocks and different things, and bury that carbon dioxide as rocks within the earth in a whole series of cycles that draws down carbon dioxide. And Martin mentioned something this morning which was really very interesting. Do you want to repeat what you said? Because I like the analogy of...
What did I say?
So what Martin said was, if we took from 100 million years ago until the ice really set in, the deep freeze set in Antarctica, what was happening at that point in the Earth was naturally taking in carbon dioxide and burying it in the rock record, in the carbon record, in the coal record. It was burying masses and masses of carbon to get from a hothouse Earth, greenhouse Earth, into an icehouse Earth. And then what you said was what we've done in the last, 150 years is to dig it all up again and warm up the Earth very, very quickly. Yeah. Yes.
That's the experiment. That's what we're doing. If our experiment was to see if we can create the Pliocene, that was our model. That's what we're trying to do. We've done a really good job. Right? We're spot on with that. Right? And if our plan is to create the Cretaceous, we're well on the way.
Just keep going.
Yeah, just keep going for another 60 years. We're fine. We're on it.
Martin, can I add something? Just as a small addition to that, one of the key moments in the initiation of ice on Antarctica would have been the point that you dropped the CO2 and therefore you lowered the temperature. Essentially, the freezing point intersecting with your topography. So the moment the freezing point essentially got low enough because your CO2 was low enough that you got that intersecting with the topography, you could start to grow ice.
And when that happens, it happens very rapidly. And similarly, in the opposite direction, it means that melt events, because of all these positive feedbacks in the climate system, you can also get melt events that happen very rapidly as well.
We've got another couple of questions. You want that? And was it one?
I was just wondering, are you using machine learning or other forms of artificial intelligence in your models at the moment? And if you're not, are you looking into doing that in the future?
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
So certainly on the, yeah, that's a great question. So on the statistics end of things, absolutely. For example, scoring the performance of individual models is now being done in a machine learning context. So I'm working with, for example, machine learning scientists, and we've developed systems where we can run the physical model in ensembles of the physical model, explore parameter space, and then use machine learning to actually optimize the parameters in the models and then spit that information back into the physical model. And sometimes these things actually work together, where the machine learning will give an outcome that will inform the physical model reruns, it communicates back with the machine learning, and until these things begin to, for example, come to some sort of equilibrium. So we are absolutely going down that road.
I want to add one thing to that. I think there's some really cool work I've recently seen where we're flooded with all these observational data now, right? So the satellites give us all this really important data we're looking at, and just kind of using that data to really learn about the mechanics of the ice and some of the smaller scale kind of features, what's happening where. It's really hard work for glaciologists to go out there and kind of make these beautiful movies like what you showed. So people definitely start using machine learning for that as well, to use that huge amount of data to kind of reduce it better and kind of and get to the mechanisms more easily. So it's starting.
Thank you. Good question. Jason, please.
Could you not use some DNA and genetic analysis to sort out the new droppings in the Antarctic or anywhere else? I'm sure that must have been thought of, but is it too difficult?
No, done. Yeah.
I have looked for DNA in those small twigs to see if they can give us any information, but DNA doesn't really get preserved for a very long time. It's I think tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, whereas most of the fossils certainly that I work on are millions. So we have cellulose and we have lignin and we have some of the chemical components, but not DNA, unfortunately.
You can look at DNA in more modern animals, especially marine animals, across the around the perimeter of Antarctica, and from some very cold water living squid on octopus, you know that there's a distinction, but in some species there is a real match either side of the West Antarctic ice sheet, and you'll only get that. They don't swim around Antarctica. They only get that match if the ice sheet's not there anymore. So it's proof that, if we needed it, because it's pretty obvious, that there once was an open seaway right across what is now Antarctica, which the genetics demonstrate at that point. Anyway, thank you for the question. We have a last question, I think, at the back. There we go. And then that is the last question, I'm afraid.
It's also a rather technical question. So some years ago I came across this fact that there's a constraint to computational power, that you cannot model the history of Antarctica. And I'm just curious whether this is still a big constraint or where you see the major constraint in the science advancing.
Great question.
That's a great question. Yeah, we always want
bigger. Do you want to get that microphone?
We always want bigger, faster computers. So we have, and we'll be showing this work at EGU this year, the first simulations running from before there was an ice sheet to the present day. But, okay, so this is our first stab at simulating the entire 34 million year history of the ice sheet, including, and this is a neat hook for the geologists, sediment production under the ice sheet, and we track it going to the edge of the continent that potentially geologists might be able to use, and they might be able to actually look at the packages of sediment that the model simulates It grows and shrinks. It changes its style of behavior when we go from the Eocene, or from the Oligocene into the Miocene to the Pliocene. These are the kinds of data that we use to tune it. It's a really interesting exercise. The problem is that the computers are not fast enough to let us do it at a resolution, a spatial resolution, that would let us use what we're learning from this really neat thing to the future. So there's still a bit of a disconnect, but it's a great question. We're always still limited. The entire climate, whether it's meteorology, you talk to a global climate modeler, there's still a limitation that's based on computation.
But Alan, and then Jane. Alan, go on.
Yeah, and I think it's an important point, and actually Dan alluded to it in his talk as well, is that, of course, there are a lot of new techniques, there are a lot of new models coming online that in theory we would be absolutely delighted to employ in anger to the paleoclimate problems that we're looking at. But one of the things that we have to do, of course, in the paleoclimate simulations is we have to change the model setup so much that actually those models then have to run for a long time to bring them into equilibrium. So, when you're talking about these wonderfully complex and capable CMIP6 class models that are going to be shown in the IPCC report, the technical and computational demand of trying to come up with just a single simulation, actually, with one of those is almost overwhelming. And I think that's where the needs of the paleoclimate community in some respects do not perfectly match with the model development community for the modern, because one of the key things, and you've seen it during this afternoon, the key thing that we're trying to do is assess uncertainty. And the way that you try to assess uncertainty is you need to do a lot of simulations. And it's hard to do that with models that run at half a year a day.
So,
sorry, Jane. Last one.
Yeah.
I also think it's important that you get the question right, not just the model. So Rob said he was going to model from 34 million years onwards at the onset of the ice and the build-up of the ice sheet. Well, I would question that, Rob, because 34 is a really important time. In one of the cores, that's when we saw the first evidence of glaciation at the margins of Antarctica. So that means there must have been an ice sheet on the centre of Antarctica before that. So I would maintain the ice sheet in Antarctica has been there much longer than 34, Rob. So go on, extend your models, please.
Yeah, see.
So we'll take that for later. We'll do it later. Because we have to wrap up. Now listen, everybody.